5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously circulated address or contact full committee staff. As a reminder to members, staff, and others physically present in this room, for guidance from the Office of Attending Physician, masks must be worn at all times during today's proceeding, except when a member or witness is speaking. I'm trying to do both. Please also sanitize your seating area. The Chair views these measures as a safety issue and therefore an important matter of order and decorum for this proceeding. For members participating remotely, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you are not recognized by the Chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with House Resolution 965 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they aren't under recognition to eliminate background noise. We have a quorum, and I now recognize myself for opening remarks. This is likely the final hearing of the Foreign Affairs Committee for the 116th Congress and my final hearing as chairman. Yesterday we had a hearing on the Balkans, a region that's near and dear to my heart, and today we'll deal with another policy area that's been a focus of mine for decades, Syria. From the Syria Accountability Act, which became law in 2003, my bill designed to push Syria out of Lebanon, to the Free Syria Act of 2012, which was the first legislative proposal to arm the Free Syrian Army, the opposition to Assad. Through the end of my time in Congress, I've worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle and with outside groups to push back on the murderous regime in Damascus and support the democratic aspirations of the Syrian people. I have spoken about Syria from this dais more times than I could count in the last few years, and each time I can't help but think that there's no way it could get worse, and then it does. Assad's henchmen butcher civilians in the street. They drop barrel bombs full of shrapnel and glass designed to maim and disfigure. ISIS takes over large swaths of Iraq and Syria, barbarically raping, stealing, and murdering. Russia's Air Force enters the war, further weaponizing the sky. The regime gives ultimatums to people who are so hungry that they are eating the grass on the ground. Kneel or starve. China and Russia block humanitarian assistance from getting to the people who need it the most. The Trump administration cuts off assistance to the vulnerable people of Syria and threatens to break off cooperation with our Kurdish partners, threatening any gains against ISIS and alarming our closest partners. I say enough. There's been too much suffering, too many lives lost, and far, far too little done to stop the carnage. Too little by the United States through different times. Too little by our partners. And this conflict is far from over. It's humanity's wound, and it continues to fester. I remember sitting here as the ranking member of this committee in 2014, surrounded by photographic evidence of torture and violence in Syria's prisons, listening to the agony of Caesar, a brave military photographer who defected, smuggling thousands of photographs and giving us proof of Syria's killing machine. That heartbreaking testimony compelled me to introduce the Syria Civilian Protection Act. The Caesar Act imposes the most sweeping sanctions on the Syrian regime and its backers since the start of the civil war. Unless they stop the violence against their own people and take irreversible steps towards peace, the United States must raise the price of their choices. We worked carefully with the humanitarian community to ensure that the Caesar Act would not prevent humanitarian assistance from getting to vulnerable populations. Those members of Congress who were here then remember those horrific pictures of dead bodies and people just being tortured and killed. They were horrific pictures. They look like they came from the Holocaust in Germany and Poland during World War II. It really just made me sick. So we are making sure that humanitarian assistance can get to vulnerable populations. My bill passed the House 3 times before becoming law last year. The anniversary of its enactment prompted me to call this hearing today. How is the CESA Act being used to end the conflict? Are we closer to a more peaceful and stable future for the Syrian people? At a time when ISIS is reconstituting in Syria, how can we ensure that they and other violent terrorist organizations aren't able to exploit Assad's continued presence to win the propaganda war? Congress must be part of the solution. Getting Syria right won't be easy, as the last few years have shown us. We won't find a silver bullet in a grand bargain, geopolitical positioning, humanitarian assistance, or military action. Ending the violence and getting the Syrian people on the path to a brighter future will require some fresh thinking. I appreciate the fact that the next administration faces a wide range of pressing crises and critical negotiations around the world, but I would urge, please don't forget about the Syrian people. America is a haven for the oppressed. My grandparents fled the pogroms in Europe more than a century ago. The idea that only 2 generations later their grandson would be a member of Congress, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, it would only have been a dream to them. But then again, those dreams and ideas are what have drawn immigrants to our shores for generations. I hope that my family's story demonstrates that we can't turn our backs on victims of persecution. And I hope we can agree that refugees should always have a place in our country. I also hope that the next administration will welcome Syrians who have been pushed from their homes, as well as other desperate people from around the world. At our best, we're a country of generosity and acceptance. The last 4 years have not shown us that way. It's time to turn things around. I look forward to our witness's testimony, and I'll first yield to my friend, our ranking member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for any opening comments he'd like to offer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you mentioned, this is likely our last hearing of this Congress, and it's really been an honor to serve with you as the ranking member on this committee. And I want to thank you for the respect that you've shown the other side of the aisle, as you always have, in a very bipartisan way, allowing many of our members to pass bills in the House. I gave my farewell address to you on the House floor, if anybody would like to see it. But I'm proud of our time together and our record of accomplishment. I think we passed probably more bills than any committee in this Congress, and just about every one on a bipartisan basis. And sir, I think that's a record we should all be proud of, but especially you. And you've governed this committee with civility, with dignity, as real clear politics stayed an island of calm in a sea of partisanship. That is this committee. It's the tradition of this committee. As I've been on this committee for 16 years, I know you've been on it for many more than that. And so I want to just say thank you for your service. We're going to miss you, but I know that you'll be close by. And most of all, I've really enjoyed our friendship together, and that will always continue.
Thank you.
And
thank you, Mr. McCall. Will you yield to me?
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you. Mr. McCall, I just want to return the compliment and say that it has been an absolute pleasure to work with you and your staff to help us pass bills and do what's right for the United States and around the world. We like to say that the Foreign Affairs Committee, you and I have both said that many times, is the most bipartisan committee in Congress. And I think that we've proven that the people who are elected from different parties can work together, should work together. After all, we're all Americans. We all love this country. We care about this country. We may have, from time to time, different ideas, but we should always remember that other people from other parties are not the enemies. There are plenty of enemies of the United States around the world, but it doesn't exist in this room or in the Capitol or any place else where we conduct our business. And I think it's important to remember that, because what happens is, and I've been here a while now, you really don't get to know people unless they're on your committee or from your home state. You just don't have much opportunity to get to know people. Sometimes you've taken trips with them and you know them because of those trips around the world, different places. Sometimes you see them in the gym when you're working out. But by and large, if the person is not from your home state and not on your committees, there isn't much interaction. And when there's not much interaction, people don't know the other people, and some people demonize, and the whole cycle begins again. I'm glad that we don't do that on this committee. It really makes me very proud of every member on this committee, Democrat or Republican, because we try very hard to do what we are told, what we're supposed to do, and that is to work for the American people, and that's what we do. And so let me again say, Mr. McCall, it's been an absolute pleasure working with you, being a colleague of yours, and being a friend. I'm not, it's difficult sometimes. Life gives you bumps and knocks, but I've always believed in picking yourself up and walking with your head held high and continuing the business. I know that last weekend I was over your house for dinner. Thank you. Along with the previous chairman of this committee, Mr. Royce. And it was just a pleasure to be able to go over things from the committee and go over other things. So, Mr. McCall, I thank you for those kind words. I thank you for everything you do, and I thank everyone on this committee, both Democrats and Republicans. Thank you for allowing me to be the chair. Thank you for really passing good legislation and doing things to make the lives of people better, make the lives of Americans better. I love this country, and I'm so fortunate to be here and to serve in the United States Congress. As was mentioned in my remarks, my grandparents came here in 1907, and if they hadn't come here and they stayed behind in Europe, they would have almost certainly perished in the Holocaust. And so this country of my birth, my parents' birth, means so much. When people say, God bless America, I really say it too. So I turn it back to you, Mr. McCall. Thank you for everything. And we'll continue to, I know, keep in contact.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And your style of leadership has really been a model. And I think the way we've worked together, who would think a Democrat from the Bronx and a Republican from the heart of Texas could work so well together, right? And but it's a model for the rest of the Congress, and your legacy, sir, will continue. You have quite a legacy with this committee, and you will always be remembered. And I look forward to when we get back to some normalcy to having your portrait up in this beautiful committee room.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And we've worked a lot to advocate on behalf of the Syrian people, which is the subject matter of this hearing. And you and I saw those photographs that was taken by Caesar. They were horrific. They were reminiscent of the Holocaust. But that is the reality on the ground in Syria. And I want to thank the witness for being here, Mr. Rayburn. I know that you just came back from Syria, so I really look forward to your testimony. And I have some very good questions, I think, for you. But, Mr. Chairman, we worked together on Syria to pass legislation sanctioning Turkey's invasion of Syria, to draw attention to the assault on civilians in Idlib, to support access for humanitarian assistance, and to oppose countries renewing ties with the Assad regime. And as author of the Caesar Act, Mr. Chairman, you worked for years to pass sweeping sanctions to cut off resources to the Assad regime and its backers. Now we're already seeing how these sanctions are crippling Assad's reign of terror. And we worked together on the Syrian policy, again, not as Republicans or Democrats, but as Americans and as human beings trying to protect innocent civilians. But there's still more to be done. For starters, we should stand by our allies in northeast Syria to give them more opportunities to succeed. In addition, I recently spoke with key people on the ground in Syria who provided me with important updates. They've all said that we need more support and we need it now. And we want to find the best manner to do that, and I hope we can get them the relief they need as soon as possible. I'd also like to once again encourage members of the international community to refrain from diplomatic engagement with Assad. The world cannot accept a butcher like Assad as the leader of Syria. There can be no justice if relations with Syria return to business as usual. So I want to welcome our guests here today. We're pleased to have you. I'm especially hoping you will address how the administration has used the sanctions and other tools to secure justice for the Syrian people and further cripple Assad and his Russian and Iranian backers. Our goal should be to force the regime and its sponsors to stop the slaughter of innocent people and to provide the Syrian people a path towards reconciliation, stability, and freedom. Chairman Engel, your tireless work to fight for the Syrian people is at the core of your legacy, as I mentioned before. So I want to thank you for everything you've done on behalf of the Syrian people and for making their struggle for freedom remain at the top of your agenda in this Congress. I think it's fitting that this is the last hearing that we have in this Congress on this such important issue and such a humanitarian crisis. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I thank my friend, Mr. McCall. Thank you for everything you do. Our witness today is Mr. Joel Rayburn, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Levant Affairs and Special Envoy for Syria. Without objection, the witness's complete prepared testimony will be made a part of the record, and I'll now recognize you for 5 minutes to summarize your testimony, Mr. Rayburn.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here to testify about the Syrian conflict today. It's one of the most dangerous crises in the world in both geostrategic and humanitarian terms. Before I begin, I want to thank Chairman Engel for his years of service, especially his dedication to solving this conflict in Syria and his enormous work on the Syria Civilian Protection Act. This is a remarkable legacy, Mr. Chairman, and the Syrian people know that. And I would add that in literally every engagement that we have with Syrian civil society, the term Kanun Kaiser, as the Syrians refer to the Caesar Act, is mentioned. They know its importance, and they thank you for your work and the work of this entire committee in doing that. I've just returned from a trip to the Middle East last night, during which I discussed the importance of advancing an enduring political settlement to the Syrian conflict with our allies and partners in Israel, Turkey, Egypt, and the Gulf countries, while also spending time with our local partners in northeast Syria. For several years now, our vital national security concerns have led the United States to pursue the interconnected goals of an enduring defeat of ISIS and al-Qaeda in Syria, the withdrawal of all Iranian-commanded forces from Syria, and a lasting political solution to the underlying Syrian conflict consistent with UN Security Council Resolution 2254. Based on what I've just heard from our allies and partners and what we are seeing on the ground in Syria, it is my assessment that each of our major goals in Syria is within reach. And I also assess that our leverage is growing over time. Our adversaries in Syria, conversely, have failed to achieve their goals. The Assad regime remains a pariah, excluded from the Arab League, mired in an economic crisis of Assad's own making, and unable to attract international investment. The ability of the Syrian regime and its allies to dictate the terms of Syria's future is waning. The path to our objectives is still filled with challenges, but the strategic situation today is encouraging, and it attests to what can be done when diplomatic efforts are strongly backed by both this Congress and responsible members of the international community. A few words about the U.S. approach to implementing and achieving these goals. We believe U.S. strategic objectives are best achieved by an action plan that includes various elements. First, we must carry out a political process and a nationwide ceasefire as outlined in UN Security Council Resolution 2254. Second, we should continue our counterterrorism campaign and preserve the global coalition to defeat ISIS. And third, we must press for the withdrawal of foreign forces not present in Syria before 2011. The United States has developed a broad coalition of like-minded countries to accomplish this plan of action, and we have separately engaged with Russia on such an approach. I would add that in addition, the United States government will continue to work for the return of Austin Tice, Majd Kamomaz, and every other American who is held hostage or wrongfully detained in Syria, and we will not give up on those objectives. Each of the goals that I outlined above in the action plan requires sustained pressure in order to succeed. Along with the European Union, we are applying economic pressure via sanctions against the Syrian regime and its enablers, as you know. The entire international community recognizes the strong bipartisan support from you that led to the passage of the Caesar Act legislation. And believe me, Assad and his supporters recognize this as well. I particularly want to thank Chairman Engel for his leadership, as well as the whole committee for making the Caesar Act a reality, as I mentioned before. Since the Act's adoption, the administration has used the Caesar Act and other related authorities to designate over 90 individuals and entities who use their wealth or positions to support Assad's war. Alongside our economic pressure, our political pressure includes partnerships with Syrian civil society to remind the world of the regime's atrocities, as well as active outreach to the Syrian opposition. On the diplomatic front, we lead efforts to withhold normalization or reconstruction assistance to the Syrian government absent progress on the political process. And we also support the UN-led political process roadmap in Geneva. And finally, our military pressure comes in the form of U.S. and allied military actions in response to Assad regime chemical weapons use and through U.S. leadership of the global coalition to defeat ISIS. And we also continue to support the defeat ISIS operations of our local Syrian Democratic Forces partners in the Northeast. In closing, we and our international partners are clear that there will be no peace or stability in Syria until the violence ends, there is accountability for Assad's atrocities, and the political process truly takes hold and meets the aspirations of the Syrian people. That means we will continue to marshal all of our effective economic, political, and diplomatic tools to ensure that this brutal Syrian regime does not dictate the terms bringing this nearly 10-year conflict to a close. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rayburn. Thank you for your good work. Without objection, I'd like to place into the record a statement from the Syrian American Council and Americans for a Free Syria. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes each. Pursuant to the rules, all time yielded is for the purpose of questioning our witness. Because of the hybrid virtual format of this hearing, I will recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know and we will come back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. And as we start the questioning, I'll start by recognizing myself. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, I introduced the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act, the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act, several years ago as a response to what we saw in this room. I mentioned before those horrific pictures of all these dead people, emaciated, just awful, awful. I'll never forget it. The utter disregard for human life and the torture of innocent victims, men, women, and children, Muslims and Christians. This legislation passed into law last December and mandates the most sweeping sanctions on Assad's enablers. I've welcomed some recent Caesar designations against Syrian individuals, but I would point out that the goal of the legislation was to pressure Assad's international support system and raise the cost of bankrolling the wholesale slaughter of the Syrian people. But other than one Lebanese shipping company, non-Syrians have not been sanctioned under the Caesar Act. Why are we not using the Caesar Act to sanction non-Syrians? In particular, why have there been no designations by us of Russian companies and individuals who are so clearly and shamelessly giving Assad a lifeline? Using executive authority instead of Caesar implies that the administration is looking for a more flexible way to remove these sanctions should the time come. The bar for removal of the sanctions under Caesar is fairly high, requiring the Syrians to, among other things, stop the violence against civilians, stop their chemical weapons program, and free political prisoners. Are there plans between now and January 20th to sanction non-Syrians under the Caesar Act? And after January 20th, are there going to be plans to do that as well? Given broad bipartisan and bicameral support for the Caesar Act and its full implementation, how could this administration and the next administration more fully utilize the authorities afforded to it by the bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Concerning the question of non-Syrians and targeting them under the Caesar Act and related authorities, we certainly will, I think, extend Caesar Act designations to non-Syrians in the future because we agree with you and we understand the intent of the Caesar Act provisions is to separate the Assad regime from its sources of international support. I will say that the Caesar Act has had a remarkable chilling effect on those in the outside Syria who might otherwise restore economic relations with the Assad regime or do some sort of business with the Assad regime or in the same interest with the Assad regime. So to some degree, Mr. Chairman, the Caesar Act has been successful in that regard even without designating a large number of non-Syrians under the Caesar Act authorities so far. And we have been pleasantly surprised by that. In other words, increased international economic relations with the government of Damascus has been the dog that didn't really bark. Now, concerning the question of how we choose which authorities we use to make designations. To be honest with you, there's no larger purpose behind that as we do our targeting internally between the State Department and the Treasury Department with the support of the intelligence community. Believe me, we carry out our designations against specific targets just using the most efficient, the quickest, the most expedient, let's say, sanctions authorities. But there's absolutely no intent behind using other authorities in the Caesar Act to make it easier to lift pressure on the Assad regime in the future. In fact, our position is that we need to continue to put accumulating pressure on the Assad regime and its backers in the future, and that's going to be our approach. Your question of will there be additional designations under the Caesar Act between now and January 20th, I can't specify specifically what sanctions will do in the coming weeks, but we are intending to do some. And in fact, Mr. Chairman, we now have an interagency machinery, an interagency apparatus that is, I would say, clicking on all cylinders in terms of finding the nodes of the Assad regime's illicit finance network that we most need to target, to be able to also see how the regime tries to evade sanctions and to try to stay one step ahead of the regime, and that is working. That is working very well. I'm very pleased with the way that has happened.
My time is running out. I want to try to get in one quick question because I think it's really important, and I think it shows why we're so unhappy with what's happening. Because as this year draws to a close, the Assad regime, supported by Russia and Iran, has recaptured most areas previously held by opposition forces and continues attacks on pockets of Syrian resistance and civilian infrastructure in the northwest part of Syria. In the northeast, Turkey maintains its hold on territory gained in its October 2019 invasion and continues to harass and displace Syrian Kurdish populations, which of course have been very loyal to the United States. So I want to just ask you, what's the future of the remaining pocket of opposition-held territory in and around Idlib in northwestern Syria? And could you describe the extent of devastation and human tragedy caused by the Assad regime there?
I absolutely agree with you. The Assad regime, the war that the Assad regime and its allies have been waging against Idlib and the surrounding regions and against the innocent civilians there has to stop. What we've seen in northwestern Syria in the Idlib region is in the last 9 months or so, essentially a military stalemate. After many months of the Assad regime with Russian and Iranian and Lebanese Hezbollah backing, being able to retake territory. We saw that come to a halt when they ran up against the Turkish military supporting Syrian Syrian armed opposition groups in February and March of this year, and we have not seen any indication that the Assad regime can overcome that military opposition from Turkey and the Turkish-supported groups there. So there's a military stalemate. That does not mean that conditions on the ground are good for the civilians in Idlib and the surrounding region. They're absolutely atrocious. The Assad regime continues to fire artillery, so do its military allies. And so this is why we believe the pressure has to continue on the Assad regime. We have to continue to use the combination of all our tools of pressure to make it clear to the Assad regime that there's no viable course for them other than coming to a political solution under UN Security Council Resolution 2254.
Thank you very much. And before I turn it over to Mr. McCall, I ask unanimous consent to allow Congressman Green of Texas to participate in this hearing. Without objection, so moved. Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to welcome Congressman Green to the committee. I want to thank you for your resolution on Austin Tice that we passed this week. Very bipartisan. His family is they're constituents of yours and very close to my district and from our home state of Texas. I've been briefed on this in the classified space, so I'm not going to ask you more details about that, but I do want to thank the administration for your efforts because I know you've been pressing very hard for his release, and we thank you for that. I want to talk about sanctions, what is Turkey doing, and then the threat of ISIS. On the sanctions, as the chairman stated, we're looking forward to these sanctions really being utilized to the fullest extent as intended by Congress. But I also want to ask you about the northeast quadrant of Syria, where you have the Syrian Democratic Forces. There have been calls to lift sanctions on the SDF. I don't know how you could do that because it's all within the same country. Can you speak to the wisdom of, and if we can't do that, how can we help the SDF? They seem to be somewhat successful in bringing all these pockets of different ethnic backgrounds together under one sort of democracy that actually seems to be working and is obviously in loyal opposition to Assad.
Thank you, Congressman. Well, first observation I'd make is that we understand in implementing the Caesar Act that this committee generated that the focus of the Caesar Act is to be squarely on the Assad regime and its enablers. So we have no intention of releasing designations that would harm our partners in the liberated territories of Syria that are beyond the regime's control.
So in other words, you would argue that the sanctions are not being applied to the SDF?
That's correct.
So, I mean, okay. And maybe we can follow up on this when I have more time to talk to you. But I am very interested. I know you met with Nadine on the ground. I'm have a good friendship with her, and I get their reporting, and it is an area of concern. We want to help the SDF as much as we can. Turkey in Syria, these Turkish forces, who are they? Because I've seen pictures and had reporting that it almost looks like they're hiring mercenaries in Syria, and some reporting that they've actually hired former ISIS members. Can you give me shed some light on that?
Yeah, Congressman, the opposition fighters, the opposition armed groups that are supported by Turkey, a great many of them are different elements of the Free Syrian Army, part of which has been organized more formally into an organization called the Syrian National Army, which gets material support, training, and so on, and basing assistance from Turkey, and is focused on military pressure against the Assad regime and its allies. And the focus of their resistance to the Assad regime and its allies is northwestern Syria. There are some that have been active in northeastern Syria. But I would say, so this is, now, we've seen some of the same information that you have, and this is something that we, when we see signs that there are some elements that are potentially extremist, or we suspect they have, then we raise that with our Turkish counterparts. We'll also raise that with the Syrian political opposition.
And my time's running out. I mean, it concerns me because they look like radical extremist Islamists, to be honest with you. And Turkey, of course, came in, and we worked our Delta forces. Of course, it's who are our friends in Syria? That's a real question, right? But when our Delta forces came in, worked with with the Kurds to crush ISIS. That's how we defeated ISIS in Syria. And then to see Turkey go in, and I know the PKK has been designated a terrorist organization, and they're within that, but to see Turkey come in and crush the very forces that we worked with to defeat ISIS is disturbing as well. Can you talk about the detention camps? My last question. The threat of ISIS still in Syria, and I get reports about these detention camps. They're releasing, ISIS members.
Mr. McCall, thank you for raising this. The detention camps, which has some ISIS members, the ISIS members who are known to be ISIS members, a lot of these are in essentially, they're in detention facilities specialized for holding, with much greater security and so on. And there are a large number of those kind of fighters, many of them who are not from Syria. They're from all over the world, from the Arab world, from Europe, from the Caucasus, Central Asia, and so on. That's a big problem. There are other camps for displaced people, many of whom either had to flee from the campaign, the last stages of the campaign against ISIS, or some of whom are ISIS children. They're the children of former ISIS families, or they're women. There are a large number of women who were members of ISIS, or some of whom were, virtually held hostage by ISIS. There's a very large number of those, and it's very concerning because the population, for example, at the camp at Al Hol is somewhere around 70,000 people. There are more than 30,000 Iraqis. There are somewhere just shy of 30,000 Syrians, and then there are more than 10,000 who are from neither Iraq nor Syria. They're from other countries, and it's been very challenging to get the government of Iraq and the governments of those other countries to cooperate with us in repatriation of those non-Syrian individuals back to their countries of origin for a variety of reasons. But the longer that they stay in Syria, it is a very big concern that large concentration of people is vulnerable to radicalization, that you would have children who might be exposed to radicalization and could be a problem. It could be the next, unfortunately, the next potential caliphate. So it's a problem that we really need to urgently try to get a solution to.
Yeah, it's very complex. And thank you for your testimony. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At our penultimate hearing yesterday, I had a chance to pay tribute to you, and so I'll do it in more abbreviated form today. It's been an honor to serve with you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to serving with Mr. McCall and especially with Greg Meeks. This is apparently the last time I will be able to ask my questions immediately after the gentleman from the Bronx, and perhaps unfortunately it's the last time I'll be able to ask my questions before the gentleman from Queens. We have a War Powers Act that is designed to restrict the executive branch's authority to deploy our forces into harm's way. We have deployed forces into harm's way in Syria under the 2001 AUMF that authorizes going after al-Qaeda and presumably, or at least arguably, its progeny, such as ISIS. But there are many interests in Syria that might warrant or might not warrant the use of our forces. You have to wrestle with those from a policy standpoint, but do you feel constrained at all by the Constitution and the War Powers Act to not deploy American forces in harm's way against any adversary that is not a descendant of Al-Qaeda?
Mr. Congressman, the department's view on this is that the answer is no, that the legal authorities for our presence in Syria haven't changed, and that they're sufficient for what we need to do.
Well, there are many things you may want to do, many things the next administration wants to do. If you were to, say, fight against Assad to protect the Kurds, is that something you think you can legally do? And if so, what would be the legal authority?
Well, I mean,
I'm not saying it's a bad idea. You might want to come to Congress and seek authority, but what authority do you have now?
well, I hesitate to address a hypothetical situation like that, Congressman.
This is Congress. This all we do is talk about hypothetical situations.
I know, Mr.
Is it your intention to follow the War Powers Act?
Absolutely, Mr. Congressman.
Okay. There is an authorization to use military force to go after Al-Qaeda. Do you believe that that authorizes the administration to go after any enemy, and there are many heinous enemies in Syria, or is it limited to those heinous enemies that attacked us on 9/11?
It is the department's view, Congressman, that the 2001 AUMF provides the legal authority required to use military forces against ISIS in Iraq and in Syria.
Against ISIS, but
Against ISIS.
I mean, there's there's Assad, there's Putin, there's Erdogan. There are many other authorities who are committing murder in Syria. Do you think you have the authority to go after them?
The department's view, Congressman, also is that the 2001 AUMF also provides the authority to use force to defend U.S. coalition and partner forces that are engaged in the campaign to defeat ISIS.
Well, that's very different than attacking. Obviously, our forces, wherever they are, can defend themselves if attacked. Turkey has, the Turkish government has embraced some extreme elements of political Islam, sometimes forming alliances with those inspired by Al-Qaeda and ISIS. To what extent is the Turkish government working with Al-Qaeda and ISIS forces, or the progeny of those two organizations in Syria?
I haven't seen signs, Congressman, that the Turkish government is doing that.
Well, you talked about recruiting mercenaries.
No, I have not seen. I mean, the way my team and I see it, and the way we assess the situation, is that Turkey considers ISIS and Al-Qaeda to be threats to Turkey, that we share a threat assessment with them, and that they share with us the goal that those forces are defeated in Syria and that they leave Syria. So I have not seen a sign that Turkey is sponsoring ISIS.
In Idlib, they have worked with some forces that trend in that direction, but I can see there's support for your assessment that they're not actually dealing with ISIS or Al-Qaeda as organizations.
We also, Congressman, we see a lot of friction between the forces like the Free Syrian Army that Turkey really, wholeheartedly supports, and some of those other terrorist elements or really radical elements on the ground. There's an ongoing conflict between those all the time.
I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to join with the rest of our colleagues, and it's such a rare occasion that everybody agrees, and that is that, indeed, we appreciate Chairman Elliott Engel on his bipartisanship and the success that you've had in Congress, and the Caesar Act. It just goes on, Mr. Chairman, what you've achieved, and we appreciate from a bipartisan standpoint. In addition, I got the opportunity to actually live it with you, and that is I was on the delegation with Congressman Kurt Weldon to Pyongyang, North Korea. And you bond when you go to North Korea because to see the horror of the destitution of North Korea, the oppression of the people, and we were there in 2003. Congressman Weldon, what a visionary he was. And of course, then from there we went to Seoul, South Korea, and you saw the contrast of free market capitalism, of the success there, the democracy of Republic of Korea. And so I'll always cherish our opportunity to serve together under the most extraordinary circumstances. And but what a great example of success of free market capitalism as opposed to totalitarian socialist communism on the Korean Peninsula. Now, Secretary Rayburn, you've got the hardest job I've ever heard of, okay? Envoy to Syria. The American people need to actually see the map of what is occurring there. It's, the map itself is startling, the divisions, and it breaks your heart. I've been to the refugee camps in Jordan, and just extraordinary people under the most bizarre circumstances of so many different interests there. But what can be a great danger to all of us is the reconstitution of ISIS and its ability to expand zones in northern and central Syria. What is your assessment of the reconstitution of ISIS?
Thank you, Congressman. So it's the global coalition led by the United States achieved military victory against the ISIS territorial caliphate. That removed ISIS from the battlefield as a field army and as a proto-state that could marshal state-like resources. So we moved beyond that phase, thank God. And the same thing was done in Iraq, you know, with great sacrifice all around. Now we're in a phase where ISIS is still a threat as a clandestine terrorist network and as a guerrilla force that's trying to reconstitute itself in the remote areas of both Syria and Iraq. So they remain a danger. I would not say in northeast Syria, where the U.S. military is directly supporting Syrian Democratic Forces, we have not seen ISIS be able to come back and regain control of territory. But they do have clandestine networks that are a big danger, that are intimidating and assassinating people and trying to destabilize that region to create an opening for them to come back and hold territory. I would highlight one other danger, which is that the Assad regime and the Iranian regime are now attempting to, if you will, subcontract to ISIS, to some of those ISIS cells, to take action against the Syrian Democratic Forces, against U.S. interests, against the moderate people of the Euphrates River Valley region in particular. And it's very malicious, nefarious set of activities that we're seeing.
And that leads to the next question, and that is the assessment of the current role and priorities of the Iranian-backed forces in Syria, and how is their presence evolving, as you just indicated, in the past year?
Well, Congressman, ever since early 2017, we've seen the Iranian regime forces in Syria stop essentially taking part to a large degree in the civil war between the different Syrian sides, and they focused instead on trying to create strategic bases for Iranian military forces and Lebanese Hezbollah and try to establish a power projection platform that they can use to threaten Syria's neighbors. What we have seen over the last year, 2020, is that they've received a lot of military pressure from Syria's neighbors, and they haven't been able to establish themselves to the degree that they would like, the Iranian regime. But they have not abandoned their strategic goal of trying to turn Syria into basically an Iranian regime military garrison that they can use to pose a new threat to the entire region.
And it's encouraging your report on the Caesar Act, a credit to the chairman and ranking member that is passed. Is there more that Congress can do to back up sanctions against the Assad regime?
I would say, so the authorities are good, Congressman. We really like the authorities. We can do a lot under the authorities. I think where the departments can use help now is in being able to build out the infrastructure to take the optimal use of the authorities. So I think, you know, it would be good to have more analysts, to be able to have more bandwidth, to be able to do more sanctions all the time. We scrape together as much bandwidth as we can, and we've increased that through cooperation with the Treasury Department over the last year. We worked very hard on it, but I would really like to see in the future, I think, and Congress could really help out by helping to increase the State Department and Treasury Department and intelligence community's bandwidth to do more of these sanctions at a higher operational tempo.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. But Secretary Rayburn, you are very encouraging how positive you are, and thank you for your service.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. It's now my pleasure to call on the gentleman who will be the next chairman, will succeed me as chairman of this committee, Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks and I have been friends and colleagues for a long, long time, not only here in Washington, but in New York, where we both reside. And we have been active there, very active in New York as well. I know Mr. Meeks very well, and I know that he will do an excellent job as chairman. He works very hard, he's smart, he's fair. He has a great knowledge of both running a committee and also of all the hot spots and problems around the world. And so I am delighted to call him Mr. Chairman, and delighted to be able to work with him. And I want to make him a pledge that whatever help he needs from me, he'll automatically get it. And I look forward to him doing many, many great things for our country and for the world. So it's my pleasure to call upon my good friend from New York. He and I, again, have a lot in common in terms of where we both grew up and types of families we came from. And again, it shows how America is a wonderful, welcoming place, and where people can do well and work hard and attain certain kinds of goals. So I look forward to watching Mr. Meeks as chair, and I know he'll do an excellent job. So it's my pleasure to call upon the next chairman of this committee, Gregory Meeks of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as I said, it's bittersweet for me because we are such good friends. And I cherish you as a friend and as a chairman and as a leader. And so for me, unlike many others that may be on this committee, me and you are going to be seeing each other and talking to each other quite frequently, as I'm going to need your strong advice and encouragement as we move forward. I'm not saying goodbye to you because you're going to still do a lot from me. We're going to be working at the hip, in the way that you've conducted this committee. I look forward to following those footsteps, working with Mr. McCall in a bipartisan way to keep the traditions of this committee moving forward and the standards that you've set, which are very high standards. But I know for some of my colleagues, because of geographic concerns, they may not get to see and talk to you often, but Gregory Meeks will get to see and talk to you often and utilize your expertise, your advice, and your thought patterns as we move forward. So this is just a blip in our piece, not seeing you in Washington maybe as often, or particularly on Capitol Hill and in the hearing rooms, and traveling with you. Although I've learned lessons on how to do appropriate travel so that the members, when we do travel, or get to travel again, get to really get on the ground and understand what's taking place on the ground, as many of your co-dels have been. So I, again, look forward to our continuing relationship in regards to trying to make sure that individuals who grew up in public housing in the greatest country of the world can lead this great committee called Foreign Affairs and actually do some good in the world, because you've clearly put your stamp on progress and goodness in the United States and around the world. So, and I thank you for that and look forward to continue to work with you. Let me also thank Mr. Rayburn for your testimony here today. I know that you served over 26 years in our military and graduated out of West Point. So we thank you so very much for, and are very grateful for your service to our great country. My question is, it is, as most of my colleagues have said, it is quite difficult in Syria when you look at the that you've got nations like Russia that have destabilized the region, and having a coherent strategy to be is counterproductive action by Turkey and Erdogan. And I'd like to, think that we must do all the things that we can with empathy so that we can never lose sight of the Syrian people and the human tragedy that is taking place there. They continue to suffer very terribly. Now, for me, I believe in a multilateral approach. I think multilateralism is very, very important in trying to pull together our allies and move and do things in a way that we can make sure that we are standing up for our values and our opposition to human rights indiscretions. In my opinion, the administration has failed to stand up to Russia. And the Trump administration has, in fact, enabled Putin's belligerence and expanding zone of influence in the region. And I see them as being one of the dominant forces there, including, as you've indicated, Iran. But there appears to be no clearly discernible strategy applied consistently across the administration. I don't see that has happened. So my question is, what path forward is there for the U.S. and for the United States partners to lead a strategic change in Syria? How can we come together with our partners to lead this strategic change that has to take place in Syria? I don't think it can be done by the United States alone. I think it's got to be done with our strategic partners also.
Mr. Meeks, I agree with you 100%. The United States, in order to achieve our goals in Syria, particularly a political solution to the Syrian conflict under UN Security Council Resolution 2254, we've got to continue to work with our European partners, our partners in the Arab world, and others in the international community who are like-minded, who share with us the judgment that in order for there to be a stable Syria, a peaceful Syria, not just for the sake of the Syrian people, but for our own vital interests, including our vital security interests, there's got to be a government in Damascus that behaves differently toward the region. That is not hostile to the region around it, and that behaves differently toward its own people. It's not hostile to its own people in a way that destabilizes Syria. So I agree with you 100%. This has to be done on a multilateral basis, and that is what I and my team are working on every day.
So, I don't know, maybe I'm out of time. I've looked at the clock, but my one other question is in dealing with the Kurds. I'm concerned. What can we do in conjunction with our allies again around the globe to protect the people, the Kurds who have been working with us, and then unexpectedly we pull our troops out? What do you think we should do to protect the individuals that have been working with us through thick and through thin, whether it was dealing with ISIS crises, the Kurds were there for us and fought with us? What do you think that we could do collectively to make sure that there's not another unforeseen just pull out that leaves them subject to attacks by others, especially by Turkey?
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. I think the best thing we can do to help our local partners who have been working with us so closely in the campaign against ISIS is keep the pressure on ISIS, preserve the global coalition, continue to press home our advantage in the campaign against ISIS so that ISIS cannot return and threaten the people of northeastern Syria, including the Kurdish population there, which suffered hugely at the hands of ISIS, and then use our diplomatic efforts to try to keep the situation on the northern border of Syria as calm as possible, and to use our good offices with both sides to try to diffuse tensions there so that the focus can remain in eastern Syria, the focus can remain on the threat of ISIS, the threat that's posed by ISIS, and also the new threat that's been emerging over the last couple of years of the Iranian regime trying to carve out space in that zone. So that's what I would say is the best thing that we can do for our local partners.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Let me again say to Mr. Meeks, I know that this committee is going to thrive under his stewardship, and I look forward to all good things continuing to come out of this committee under his leadership. Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this hearing. Seems like there's not a whole lot of official business, so to speak, going on in D.C., and I appreciate your interest in keeping important things on the docket during the waning moments of the session. Thanks for calling attention to this foreign policy priority. The challenges facing policymakers with respect to Syria are numerous, obviously. The government in Damascus is a state sponsor of terrorism. It allows the Iranian regime, as Mr. Rayburn points out in his witness testimony, to regularly threaten our allies in Israel and Jordan. Over the past several years, the Trump administration has made important strides in shoring up our Syria policy, including through the implementation of the Caesar Act and working to negate ISIS and al-Qaeda's influences in the country. However, my objective today is not to highlight the successes of this administration's foreign policy. I think those achievements are plain enough to see. My purpose is to underscore that these successes are despite the best efforts of wayward, unelected bureaucrats working to undermine President Trump at every opportunity. Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit for the record a letter to Attorney General Barr demonstrating the breathtaking dereliction of duty of James Jeffrey, the U.S. Special Envoy for Syria engagement, if I may.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. President Trump announced in 2018 and again in October 2019 his decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria and fulfill an important promise to the American people. There is no ambiguity about the President's position on the issue, whether we agree with it or don't agree with it. That's why he's the Commander-in-Chief, and that's why we have elections. In a November 12th interview, with Defense One, Ambassador Jeffrey boasted that the President never did achieve his principal objective in Syria because he, Ambassador Jeffrey, intentionally undermined it. After listening to Mr. Jeffrey's counsel, President Trump decided to leave 200 soldiers in Syria. However, and as Mr. Jeffrey made abundantly clear, there are far more than 200 American troops in that country. The only issue was the President was kept in the dark about that particular material fact. This is beyond unacceptable. The President needs to be able to count on a team of advisors to carry out his policy agenda and be honest. The American people expect and deserve that. It compromises the security of our nation to have unelected bureaucrats wantonly bend and break the law. 18 U.S. Code 1001 clearly states that it is a crime to knowingly and willfully falsify, conceal, or cover up by any trick, scheme, or device a material fact. It should be of concern to everyone in this committee, that the President or Commander-in-Chief was intentionally lied to in the course of carrying out his charge. Now, that has vitally important implications for the future Syrian policy and indeed for U.S. foreign policy as a whole. I mean, we've got to be able to count on the actions and the words of the chief diplomat, which is the President of the United States. My hope is that my colleagues will join me in bringing this matter to light and ensuring that any and all appropriate legal remedies are pursued to ensure the integrity of all counsel given to a duly elected President of the United States, regardless of who that is or from what side of the aisle they come from. Mr. Rayburn, are there any implications for national security on an unelected bureaucrat to willfully lie to the President of the United States?
Mr. Perry, the State Department team, from Secretary Pompeo down to the lowest level, has been diligent in executing the President's guidance on Syria. In fact, the 3 goals that I mentioned in my testimony were goals that were given to us by the President. So we have been following the President's guidance throughout. I respect and admire Ambassador Jeffrey, but what was characterized in that interview simply, in my experience, did not happen. The State Department neither sets U.S. force levels, nor are we responsible for communicating them to the President. It's the Department of Defense that does that with the President's.
So are you saying he didn't say that in the interview?
Sir, I'm not saying that he didn't say that in the interview. What I'm saying is that that did not happen in reality. The State Department is not responsible It's not our job to.
I didn't say the State Department was responsible, but he said that he didn't follow the president's orders and that there were actually more troops left in Syria. And I'm just asking if there were policy implications or otherwise regarding those statements, or any statements future of that like, where an unelected bureaucrat, diplomat, I don't mean to say it pejoratively, makes decisions outside the commander's intent.
Sir, in my experience, it did not happen.
So one of them has to be a lie. You just don't know which one?
Sir, I can't characterize what happened in that interview that was conducted after Ambassador Jeffrey retired from the State Department. What I can say is, at no point did the State Department misrepresent our military posture in Syria. It's not our job to do that.
I yield the balance.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I be heard?
Yes, you can, Mr. Connolly.
Great. Well, I listened with great interest to my friend's concern about misrepresentations made to the president with respect to force levels in Syria. I wish we had equal fervor in protecting the president and in the country from misrepresentations about a duly elected president-elect and the process where a record number of Americans participated in a free and fair election that resulted in the election of President-elect Biden. But that's a different matter. Mr. Rayburn, what is our policy objective in Syria? What is it we want to accomplish?
Sir, as I mentioned, it's the three interconnected goals. Those are our primary focus. It's the goal of getting an enduring defeat of ISIS and al-Qaeda. It's the goal of seeing all Iranian-commanded forces withdrawn from Syria because of the destabilizing role that they play. And the third element of that is achieving a political solution to the Syrian conflict under UN Security Council Resolution 2254, the political solution.
So implicit in those three goals is part of our objective the replacement of the Assad regime?
Congressman, UN Security Council Resolution 2254 calls for a political process that will result in a transition to a different government in Syria. Now, exactly how that government is constituted, that's meant to come from the Syrian people themselves and the voice of the Syrian people in that political process.
Are we confident that there's any kind of mechanism in the near future in Syria that would accurately reflect the voice of the Syrian people in a free democratic choice of leadership?
Congressman, I think the mechanism that's outlined in 2254 is the best mechanism that we could hope for. What it's going to require to bring it about is for us to continue to employ our pressure tools to compel the Assad regime and its enablers to come into the 2254 process, to accede to that process. They're doing everything they can, Congressman, to try to stay out of the 2254 process. That's why we are putting month by month more and more pressure on them with our political pressure, economic pressure, and so on, and some with their military pressure to try to compel them to stop the war and to come into the political process.
Well, good luck with that. I don't see a lot of evidence that that's working, but that's discussion for a different day. One of the objectives you cited was defeating ISIS in Syria. Have the Kurds been allies in that effort?
The Kurdish forces that are part of the Syrian Democratic Forces and some of them in Iraq, for example, the Kurdish Peshmerga, of course, yes, they've been very important partners in prosecuting the campaign against ISIS.
Wouldn't it be fair to say, as a matter of fact, that the Kurds were, for a long time, the only element on the ground actually winning back territory and defeating ISIS on the ground?
They were a major element, that's for sure. I don't think we could say they're the only ones. I mean, because it's a campaign that was going on across both Iraq and Syria, and it was very important that the Iraqi security forces, with our help, were making huge advances against ISIS at exactly the same time that the global coalition was helping local partners who were both Kurdish and Arab, and some Christian, a Syrian Christian, in Syria to sort of make efforts on the two ends of the caliphate at the same time. So you wound up with a squeezing of the ISIS caliphate. So it had to be a comprehensive approach. The Kurdish forces under the SDF played an enormously important role in that, absolutely.
And at one point, did not President Trump decide rather precipitately to pull out U.S. troops and therefore U.S. support for the Kurds that led to the Kurds cutting a deal with Assad because they felt abandoned by the United States government?
Well, what transpired, Congressman, is that the president wound up issuing policy guidance to maintain the support to the Syrian Democratic Forces, and that's why it's going on today. I myself, just 2 days ago, I was on the ground in Hasaka, in northeastern Syria with our U.S. military counterparts and our Syrian Democratic Forces partners who are continuing a very intense campaign of pressure against the remnants of ISIS in northeast Syria.
Yes, I understand, but I seem to recall at the time when the president made this decision without consultation with serious people like, for example, Secretary Mathis, that it led to resignations, it led to condemnations of the policy. It was seen as not only inconsistent, but it could be construed as an abandonment of our Kurdish allies on the ground who had fought so valiantly against ISIS. Remember that?
Ultimately, Congressman, the president decided to maintain our support to the local partners. So I would say that abandonment didn't happen. And it's witnessed, I mean, I saw it with my own eyes just a couple of days ago. The relationship between our forces and our diplomats on the ground. I have a small team of diplomats that are there as well. With the Syrian Democratic Forces remains vital for the security of northeast Syria.
If I have any time left, let me just ask a humanitarian question. How many refugees have been generated by the cascading crises and conflicts in Syria? How many Syrians are refugees now? We cannot, you're mute.
Sorry, I muted myself instead of unmuted myself. There, more than 5 million, well over 5 million Syrians are refugees, Congressman, and another almost 6 million or more who are internally displaced. So it's more than 11 million Syrians. That represents more than half of Syria's pre-war population are displaced from their homes as a result of the conflict.
So,
Gentleman's time
well,
has
can I just
expired.
ask real quickly, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
And how many Syrian refugees have been allowed into the United States in the last year?
In the last year, Congressman, I believe the number is 481.
5 million refugees, and we've accepted 481. You think that's doing our fair share? And I'll end with that.
Thank you.
Your number is correct. I'll just end, Mr. Chairman, by saying I just think it's scandalous that this administration has abandoned refugees. We talk about trying to have a resolution in Syria, and yet we've almost closed the doors. We've gone from accepting 5,500 refugees the last year of the Obama administration to 481 last year. And by the way, in this fiscal year, a total of 8 with 5 million refugees. I think that's scandalous, and I think it frankly undermines whatever policy we're pursuing in Syria. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just first off say that obviously Syria is a huge tragedy, and I think, you know, in hindsight, we're going to look back and see the things we should have done and didn't do, and I think there's this idea that America's war fatigued and any involvement anywhere is, you know, over the top, and but I just remember early on with people using different examples. If the U.S. intervenes, you're going to see all this horrible stuff happen, and If we don't, it won't. But I think where we're at in Syria is beyond even our wildest kind of horrible scenario. You have, in essence, kind of great world powers all parked there. You always are on the edge of some new conflict brewing, and of course the human tragedy is unspeakable. You think about the 7 million refugees, as you mentioned. That is a prime breeding ground and recruiting ground for terrorism. If you have no hope and opportunity, it's really easy to be susceptible to somebody coming along and saying, the West is at fault. Here's some extreme ideology. Your hope is in this, and it's easy to recruit terrorists out of it. But I just want to ask you, sir, and thank you for being here, by the way. I appreciate it, and thank you to the chairman for calling this. One area that I believe the administration's done a good job is in pushing back against Iranian influence in Syria. And through your maximum pressure campaign, the IRGC both has limited funds and a limited willingness to conduct their malign influence in Syria. Can you talk a little bit about how Iran's calculus has changed following the increase in sanctions and the strike that killed Soleimani?
Thank you, Mr. Kinzinger. I would say that the Iranian regime over the last year, since the strike against Qasem Soleimani, I think it's been proved that the Iranian regime cannot overcome the maximum pressure that we place upon them, and they cannot overcome the military pressure that the Israelis, for example, put against the Iranian regime activities in Syria in a way that Qasem Soleimani had hoped for. However, we've also seen that though I believe the Iranian strategy in Syria has failed, and what we've seen over the last year has been demonstrated that it cannot succeed because they cannot overcome the pressure from the Israelis and from us, that the Iranian regime senior leadership remains committed to executing that strategy that really has no hope of doing what they intended it to do. And that's a very dangerous situation. So they continue to try to move in strategic weapons. They continue to try to control Syrian territory in order to establish a strategic road from Iran over to southern Syria and even to Lebanon, to threaten Syria's neighbors. And they continue to try to establish outposts, maintain militias of really non-Iranians from Iraqis, Afghans, Lebanese, and so on, as well as local Syrians that work for the Iranian regime, in different outposts to try to control territory, to both destabilize the local situation, but also to try to consolidate that strategic ground line of communications. They continue to try to do that, even though any objective assessment, I think, tells us they cannot succeed in it. But so they need to recognize reality. It means that there has to be continued pressure so that they give up the strategic goal and so that they withdraw their forces and abandon this strategy.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you look at that, you look at the Soleimani strike, and it's different than, I think, the fight against certain terrorist groups where if you kill a leader, another leader rises up. This is a situation where I think Soleimani had unique influence and unique, abilities, and they're struggling now after this. You see that in Lebanon and every place, frankly, where Iran has tried to have proxies and influence, that they've actually failed. I always think it's interesting how when the Israelis push back against Iran too close to their country in Syria, it doesn't really make news. When we do something, it's a massive thing we have to debate here. And the reality is, I think Iran is desperate. And I think, as much as I can understand my friends on the other side of the aisle with the Iran nuclear deal, I think replugging into that would only send a lifeline to Iran to continue the kind of tragedy that we're seeing. I did have a bunch more questions, but that conversation went long. I'll just say I really appreciate the work you're doing. I really appreciate the attention you've given to this. It's a huge tragedy. There's a lot more that unites Republicans and Democrats on Syria than not, and I hope that going forward we can continue to maintain pressure on Assad and understand the difficulty that some of these countries hosting these refugees have faced. So with that, thank you for being here, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Rayburn, for joining us today. I want to just take another moment to congratulate my friend, Chairman Engel, at his final hearing. Mr. Engel, during your time as chairman, you've advocated for a principled American role in the world and fostered a spirit of bipartisanship on this committee. I think it's especially appropriate that yesterday we were here focusing on the Balkans and today on the Middle East, two regions where you've played an outsized role, including and especially in Syria through the Caesar Civilian Protection Act. I value your friendship and leadership and know that you'll remain engaged on these important issues in the future. I also want to congratulate Mr. Meeks on his historic selection as chairman-elect and commend Mr. Sherman and Mr. Castro for their work on the committee, and I look forward to working with all of you in the next Congress to help restore America's global leadership. In March, we're going to mark the 10th anniversary of the start of the war in Syria. The last decade has seen the deaths of 600,000 people, the displacement of more than 11 million, both inside Syria and around the Middle East. Assad's reign of terror, including starvation and indiscriminate bombing, has caused destruction and devastation to millions of innocent civilians. The conflict and associated humanitarian tragedy destabilized neighboring countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Turkey, and will reshape the region for decades to come. For 10 years, there's been a humanitarian crisis in Syria, and ending the conflict through a negotiated diplomatic solution is key to stabilizing the Middle East and achieving U.S. interests in the region, and most importantly, providing a better future for the Syrian people. The president's policy has been defined by the irresponsible choice to rapidly withdraw U.S. forces from northeastern Syria, a decision made without coordination with our allies and partners, without much input from his advisors, leading to the resignation of Secretary Mattis. The president's decision destabilized Syria and made the American people less safe, strengthened Russia as the main international power deciding the future of Syria, and finally, it reduced U.S. leverage to shape a political outcome and tip the balance of diplomatic and military power in favor of Iran, Russia, and Assad. And if we're going to avoid a dead end in Syria and revive diplomacy, it's important that we openly acknowledge these and other mistakes and that we learn from them. Mr. Rayburn, your testimony acknowledges only a political solution will end this conflict, but that the Assad regime has held to its desire to use military force to end it. You also acknowledge that it's been exacerbated by Russia's refusal to lean harder on Assad. So we have two different political processes, Geneva and Astana, and we were sidelined in the Turkish-Russian security corridor agreement. Russia blocked Security Council resolutions that are meant to just help get assistance to those in need. And my question is pretty simple. What is our leverage at this point to jumpstart the process in a way that furthers our security interest, that protects the Syrian people, and that produces real peace rather than just a stalemate, as recently retired Special Envoy Jeffrey called it?
Thank you, Congressman. I think the centerpiece of our leverage is what we've been able to do under the Caesar Act authorities and other related authorities to apply economic pressure and the pursuant political pressure to the Assad regime and its allies. What we've seen over the past year is that, and we've learned, we weren't sure about this when we started, but what we have learned is, I think, that the Assad regime cannot absorb the shock over time of our accumulating economic and political pressure that the Caesar Act gave us. So I believe that and at the same time, in 2020, we learned that the Assad regime does not have the military wherewithal to accomplish a military victory, a military outcome, and create facts on the ground. So I've been encouraged by that. The situation on the ground for Syrian people remains awful in pretty much every corner of Syria. But strategically speaking, I think 2020 has been the year when we've seen the leverage that our adversaries in Syria have hit its ceiling, while our leverage has grown, and in particular with what we've been able to accomplish with the Caesar Act.
What about designating Russians, Mr. Rayburn?
That remains a distinct possibility.
What leverage do we have with Russia?
Well, I think we have a lot of leverage with Russia. I mean, the most important leverage we have with Russia is the pressure that we put on the Assad regime, Russia's client, which has been unrelenting, and which I know, because we have our plans, we know what we would like to accomplish with our designations and political pressure in the future. We know that pressure is only going to deepen.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I appreciate that. I just want to ask one quick question, Mr. Chairman, very quickly. You noted, Mr. Rayburn, that the U.S. will continue to work for the return of Austin Tice and Majid Kamalmaz and every other American who's held hostage or wrongfully detained in Syria. You may know I represent the Levinson family, so issues of American hostages hit very close to home for me. The members of this committee strongly support efforts to bring all Americans held in Syria home. Do you believe that those efforts to achieve their release should occur separately, or must they be a part of diplomacy to reach a political solution in Syria? And
So far, Congressman, our diplomatic engagement on trying to find out the status and get back our missing and unjustly detained Americans is carried out by our Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs. I play a close supporting role in that, but the engagement has gone through the hostage affairs side.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Chabot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to reiterate the comments relative to yourself about your leadership, and want to thank you for the many years of service and dedication and commitment you've given to us. Regardless of which side of the aisle we were on, you've treated us all with tremendous respect and deference, and you are truly what a chairman should be, and that's why you're getting so much praise from both sides. You deserve it, and we all wish you all the best in the future. And I'm running out of superlatives that I can give for you because we've had a number of hearings here, but they're all heartfelt. You're a great friend, and even though you're a Democrat and I'm a Republican, I consider you a tremendous human being, and wish you nothing but the best.
Thank you, Mr. Chabot.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Rayburn, I wanted to focus first on Idlib, if I could. The situation there in Idlib province is precarious at best, with well over 1 million internally displaced people who've been the target of Assad bombings. And what can be done to prevent Assad, backed by Russia and Iran, obviously, from invading the province or committing further atrocities there?
Thank you, Congressman. Of course, we make clear in our engagements with our Russian counterparts and with others that our political and economic pressure is meant to, among other things, in addition to pushing for a political solution to the conflict, it's also meant to deter the Assad regime from continuing this brutal war against its own people. So we apply our own economic and political pressure. We also signal support for what Turkey has done militarily on the ground in the Idlib region by being willing to use Turkish military force to stop the Assad regime and its allies from continuing an assault on those, the people who are living under horrific conditions in Idlib. So I think it's a combination of the two. It's the political and economic support that we're able to place, and it's Turkish military pressure.
Okay. Thank you. As you know, both the U.S. and Turkey have designated the PKK as a terrorist organization. How do you assess statements by Mazloum Kobani from the Syrian Democratic Forces during a recent interview with Crisis Group? It was published back on November 25th, mentioning the presence and role of thousands of PKK-trained non-Syria, so in other words, foreign elements within the SDF ranks. And are there ongoing consultations with the SDF on this issue, and if so, at what level?
We absolutely believe that it's a constructive step for all parties in northern Syria, all parties in Syria for that matter, to agree that part of settling the conflict, part of reducing tensions and violence against Syrians is that non-Syrians need to leave Syria. Non-Syrians should not be using Syria as a base to attack Syrians or to attack others in the region. So I think Mazloum's comments were very constructive in that regard. And the answer is yes, we're ready to be helpful to try to help local groups go through that process of trying to get foreign elements to leave Syria.
Thank you. I've probably got time to squeeze one more question and answer into my time. So let me go to this. Could you discuss our efforts to provide humanitarian assistance to the people of northwest Syria, and what kind of coordination mechanisms are in place with Turkey to accomplish that?
Thank you, Congressman. Well, I mean, we have a lot of coordination mechanisms. We work through, we have in fact, I have a team, the START team, that's located in Istanbul, which helps to oversee the implementation of the delivery of U.S. aid programs into northern Syria, northwest Syria in particular, where the need is so acute. We work very closely with Turkish counterparts to do that and to try to overcome some of the, the bureaucratic hurdles or logistical hurdles, because it's so essential for those people.
Thank you. Actually, I do have time to get one last one in. A central aspect of the Caesar sanctions bill, which we've already talked about in committee, was sanctions on the Syrian central bank. But thus far, the bank hasn't been sanctioned. When do you expect progress on that?
Well, I think the Syrian central bank is sanctioned under other authorities, and I think so. It's the Treasury Department which has to make a determination under the Caesar Act about the qualifications of the Syrian central bank under the Caesar Act provisions. I don't have an answer for you on when Treasury is going to complete its work on that, but I know that it's something that they've been working on for some months.
Thank you very much. My time's expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chapman. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to begin by thanking you for your extraordinary leadership of this committee. You have been a principled voice for American global leadership and for the power of America's example around the world. And you have promoted bipartisanship throughout the work on this committee in the best traditions of our national government and for the benefit of the American people. And you have obviously been a terrific leader of this committee, a great friend, and a wonderful colleague. And I, too, want to say thank you. I look forward to staying in contact with you and congratulate our incoming chairman, Mr. Meeks, who I know will be a great leader of this committee. And, of course, thank Mr. Castro and Mr. Sherman for their participation as well. I want to thank you, Mr. Rayburn, for being here today. And I want to focus first on Russian and Turkish involvement in the region. In March of 2020, Russian President Putin and Turkish President Erdogan reached an agreement that established a security corridor. And I wondered if you could tell me kind of what is the status of that? To what extent is the U.S. able to monitor military movements and violence against civilians in these areas? And how much longer do you envision this arrangement holding? There's been a lot of talk that it could collapse at any moment. So your assessment of that, please.
Thank you, Congressman. Very important issue. You're talking about the ceasefire agreement that was reached between Russia and Turkey in Sochi. That was an important point at which it was clear that the Assad regime and its allies had to abandon their major offensive to try to overrun Idlib. It was an important point when we saw the military balance, the strategic military balance, shift against the Assad regime in northwest Syria. It's been, I would say, it's been tense, but roughly durable as a ceasefire. We have not seen the Assad regime attempt to return to a major offensive against Idlib in the intervening months. And frankly, Congressman, I think that's because they recognize that they suffered a significant defeat at the hands of the Turkish military and its local Syrian partners back in February and March. So I think they realize that they cannot tangle. The Assad regime does not have the military means to tangle with the Turkish military and its local partners. So I don't expect the Assad regime to try to upset that ceasefire agreement. Now, in terms of the actual implementation of the agreement between the Russians and the Turkeys, some of that we're not privy to, but we have seen that I think it's clear that the Assad regime and Russia's preferred option of trying to achieve a military solution to the Syrian conflict was rendered irrelevant as a result of that February-March confrontation.
I want to try getting a couple more questions. The Defense Intelligence Agency reports evidence of increasing cooperation between the Syrian Democratic Forces, our Kurdish partners in Syria, and the most potent anti-ISIS force, obviously, and Russian forces. What is the administration doing to move the SDF away from cooperation with the Russians? Is that even possible? I think you're on mute.
Sorry. Since Since October of 2019 and the confrontation in northeast Syria at that time, there has been coordination between Syrian Democratic Forces and Russian forces, and even Assad regime forces in parts of northeastern Syria where the U.S. military is no longer located. What we would not like to see is that turn into some sort of political agreement where between the communities in northeast Syria
really
and
limited time. I want
Damascus.
to get one more question. My question is very specific. Is the administration doing anything to move the SDF away from cooperation with Russia?
Well, look, we maintain our partnership with the SDF, and we maintain, so we're the indispensable partner for the SDF, and we make that clear in our engagements with the
I'm not trying to
SDF.
be difficult. Just I take it that there's not a specific effort underway. I'm just raising this. I think it's a very serious issue. But I want to get to one last question. You mentioned the Al-Hol camp. It was built to house about 10,000 people, but it has housed, as you mentioned, 70,000 people for the last 2 years. 94% of them are women and children who fled ISIS-controlled areas. And so the public reporting from NGOs has been that there have been the conditions are horrific. 500 people at least last year perished in the camp due to malnutrition, poor health, and hypothermia. I just would like to know a little more about the conditions there, what we are doing, kind of what's your assessment of FDF's ability to continue to administer this camp? What is the situation with COVID in Al-Hol? And, particularly with the concerns that all of us have about the radicalization of people who are left in those conditions. Could you talk more about that camp and the prospects for kind of continuing the conditions that are there and whether things are going to improve and people are going to be repatriated, but just a more full discussion on that.
Sure. There is a COVID problem in Al-Hol. And it's very challenging because the medical conditions there, the medical infrastructure there is very rudimentary. So it is a problem. There's more help that's needed for the local authorities to try to tackle that COVID problem, and so it doesn't spread. It's a very vulnerable population, very densely contained. For the SDF to administer and secure the camp, it takes an enormous amount of resources. So, the best answer for Al-Hol camp over time is to try to reduce it. First and foremost, by vetting people who are in Al-Hol, and so those who don't pose a risk, who are Syrians, where it's possible, could return to their local Syrian communities, again, only after they've been very closely vetted and it's established that they're not a risk, and the SDF is working on that. There are more than 30,000 Iraqis that need to be repatriated to Iraq. There is not yet a fully working mechanism to make that happen. And so that needs a lot of attention. It needs a lot of diplomatic energy in the future. And then for those several thousands who are neither Iraqis nor Syrians, but who are many from Europe, from North Africa, from other places internationally, it's been very challenging to get those host nation governments to accept the repatriation of their citizens. And so that's something that really we've got to apply more energy with trying to reduce that population in the future. But the bottom line, Congressman, is the problems there are very difficult, and the best answer is to try to reduce the population of Al-Hol camp as quickly as we can. And it's very tough.
The gentleman's time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Mrs. Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to add my voice to the chorus of those expressing their praise and respect for you, your chairmanship, your bipartisanship, your leadership, and grace. So I wish you and your family all the best, and I know that you won't be a stranger to this committee or to any other service to our country. I also want to welcome.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure, sir. Welcome Deputy Assistant Secretary Rayburn, and I thank the chairman in particular again for his work on the Syria Civilian Protection Act, critical legislation that has given the United States the tools to hold the Assad regime accountable. Deputy Assistant Secretary Rayburn, I was horrified last year when Turkey initiated a military offensive against Kurdish forces in northwestern Syria. I believe that the United States has a duty to prevent genocide of the Kurds, contain ISIS so terrorists cannot regroup, and ensure any repositioning of U.S. forces will promote stability in the region. More than a year after a ceasefire resulted in the withdrawal of Syrian democratic forces from the Syria-Turkey border, how has the Turkish incursion affected the situation on the ground in Syria, particularly regarding the safety of our Kurdish partners?
Thank you, ma'am. So that situation in October, November of 2019, it was a very challenging one. It was very difficult. We were able to produce an agreement with the government of Turkey to observe a ceasefire in that zone of northeastern Syria where their military operations had extended, and that ceasefire has been essentially durable. It's a tense situation there. We see occasional flare-ups along the line, but we haven't seen any major moves from either side. And our message to both sides has been, it's not in your interest. It's not in Turkey's interest. It's not in the SDF's interest to see a renewal of that confrontation. It distracts, we think, both sides away from the major problems in Syria, which are the Assad regime, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Iranian regime, and so on. So I would say we've been able to continue the campaign against ISIS. The global coalition has been able to continue its efforts, and there hasn't been a resurgence of ISIS in northeast Syria. They continue to act as a clandestine network, but they haven't experienced a resurgence. And so it's something that has really complicated our task in northeast Syria over the past year, but we continue to try to we continue to do our work there.
And I would like to get in a couple more questions here. Assad seems to reject the necessity of unnegotiated end to the Syrian civil war, believing instead that it can achieve a military victory over opposition forces. Russia is not putting sufficient pressure on Assad to convince the regime to participate seriously in any kind of negotiations. In your view, does this undermine the Russian-backed Astana talks, and what leverage can the United States use to rejuvenate negotiations?
That's a good question. In our view, the Astana Forum, which we don't participate in, is defunct. It was meant to be a ceasefire forum, and then the Assad regime and the Russians attacked all the ceasefires, attacked all the ceasefire zones. So that's a dead forum. They still meet, but there's no political solution going to come out of the Astana Forum. That's why we spend all of our time applying pressure to the Assad regime and its allies to compel them to come into the only viable forum that exists, which is the one in Geneva, the political process in Geneva that's UN supervised under UN Security Council Resolution 2254. I think we can get them there. It will take more pressure. It will take more actions under particularly the Caesar Act and other Syria sanctions authorities, but I think we can get there.
You know, and I understand, but humanitarian assistance ensures that our efforts to hold the Syrian government accountable are not hurting the Syrian people, who have already suffered so very much. At the same time, we must prevent the regime from using humanitarian assistance to circumvent economic pressure. I understand that Russia and China are using their veto power at the UN to try to funnel aid through the government's seat in Damascus. How is this complicating our ability to provide aid to the people of Syria? And I'm out of time here, so very quickly, sir.
You got it exactly right, ma'am. It's very difficult. So a lot of the humanitarian assistance that we support comes cross-border. It doesn't go through the Syrian government in Damascus. The Russians would like to compel everyone to do humanitarian assistance cross-line, working through Damascus. We resist that. We try to exercise oversight over the humanitarian assistance that we contribute to that does have to go cross-line, and there is some. We support humanitarian assistance throughout Syria, even in the areas that the Assad regime controls. But it is something we have to watch very closely, and I think we need to work more closely with the UN agencies in the future to try to guard against the Assad regime being able to divert humanitarian assistance away from the Syrian people and into, the channels that the Syrian regime would benefit from. It is a problem we need to watch closely.
Thank you, Secretary Rayburn, for your service. Over time, I appreciate the chair's indulgence, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Wagner. Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you for all your work. I've enjoyed working with you and hope to continue to do so. Along those lines, I had an amendment that passed the NDAA that the chairman worked with me, thank you, Mr. Chairman, to establish a coordinator for ISIS detainees. And as part of the congressionally appropriated dollars for the Counter-ISIS Train and Equip Fund, the U.S.-trained Provincial Regional Internal Security Forces, PRISIFs, is funded to detain roughly 12,000 ISIS militants in custody and roughly 2,000 foreign fighters. Mr. Rayburn, could you tell us the status of that? And can you tell us with confidence that these prisoners, these dangerous ISIS and foreign fighters, that they are secure?
Congressman, it's a tough problem. I think they're secure right now, but they're secure. There's always a danger, and the longer those foreign terrorist fighters are on the ground in Syria, there's a danger that, for example, they would overextend the Syrian Democratic Forces and other local security forces that have to try to guard them, that have to secure them. And so the answer for the foreign fighters, in the same way that it is for Al-Hol camp, the answer is to try to get the foreign fighters processed and repatriated back to their home countries. And that's been very challenging.
Mr. Rayburn, are there efforts in place, not only with these detainees, but also with the refugees, to inhibit the coordination and further radicalization of those individuals? Is a real concern. So what's being done in that regard with the detainees and also with these refugees?
I would say there's not enough being done. I think, and it happens that on Monday, when I was in Northeast Syria talking to U.S. military counterparts and our local partners, that the recognition that there needs to be a de-radicalization campaign in some of, not so much the foreign fighter facilities, because those are really, a lot of those are really hardened ISIS people, but more among the displaced population or the lower threat population, maybe people that were just sort of auxiliaries to ISIS, but they weren't necessarily dyed-in-the-wool radicals, that there needs to be an effort to try to help with de-radicalization efforts there. As far as the refugees are concerned, that's an enormous problem, and really there needs to be more attention to that. It's different in each different place because the refugees are spread out over so many countries.
All right. Well, it's an ongoing concern, and I hope that some of the pullbacks we've had, some of the support we have, hasn't deteriorated or inhibited our ability to deal with an important issue. And I hope that the administration can work successfully repatriating these people so they can go back to their own countries to seek justice. Ongoing concern that I don't think was helped as we pulled back some of our influence militarily through the area. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you, Mr. Keating. Mr. Mark Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your work in this region and of course on the committee. My comments from before, just renew those and wish you the best.
Thank you.
Ranking member, thank you, sir. Thank you for your comments too. And Mr. Rayburn, thank you for your testimony today. I want to start my comments with a good hearty "Go Army, Beat Navy." I started my company, my medical company in Panama City, Florida, where I met a physician named Osama Rafai. Dr. Rafai had grown up in Syria, in fact, grown up in Aleppo. And this was in the 2007, 2008 time frame. And I got to know Dr. Rafai, and then he convinced me that I should join the Syrian Medical Society and go back to Syria to teach physicians in the country. So in the early part of 2011, I began to prep some lectures to do and to deliver in Aleppo, Syria. I was excited to go. Dr. Rafai had shared with me the amazing beauty of that city, the city of Aleppo, where Christians and Muslims work together in peace. He described it, citing examples where the Muslim families would babysit the children of Christians while the Christians did Christian festivals and services and vice versa. It was an unbelievable city. A friend calls me a few weeks into the summer and says, "Are you still going to Syria?" And I'm like, "Well, I think so." And of course, it continued to deteriorate, and I wound up not getting to go. But this war comes and destroys the beauty of that city, crushes the people of that country, spawns the amazing, unbelievable, horrific ISIS caliphate that President Trump and the United States military so crushed, and has created this unbelievable situation where Turkey and the Kurds and Russia and the Syrian government are now in this milieu, and it is probably the hardest foreign policy challenge of the United States. It's a 9.9 out of 10. Clearly, this guy Assad is a butcher, and he is following in the line. If you go and study what happened in Hama, Syria years ago, he's following in the footsteps of his father. The apple doesn't fall very far from the tree. But just a few quick questions. Most of my questions have already been asked by committee members. I just wondered, Mr. Reverend, if you could talk a little bit about Russia's long game, what their footprint is today, and what their long game is there, and what our plans are to thwart what they're doing.
Thank you, Congressman. The Russians have been there for a long time. They've had a military presence there going back, into the Cold War. So it's half a century that the Russians have had a naval base there. That they've had a very close relationship with the Syrian military. What we would like to see is that all the forces that were not there before 2011 ultimately go home. And that there's a political solution that makes it so that they have no rationale to be there. I mean, that's us included. As far as what the Russians are doing there, to be honest with you, I think the Russians now, since 2016, have been trying to enable Assad to win a military victory that he can't win, and that they can't sort of lift him up and carry him over the finish line. There's the Syrian regime military is too hollow. That regime is too brittle and weak, and so what is their long-term game? It's not clear to me that there is a viable one because of the path that they've been on. The path they've been on for the last 4 or 5 years has hit a dead end or a cul-de-sac, and there's nowhere for it to go. So to be honest with you, I think, honestly, it's time for a reality check for all the allies of Assad to realize that there can only be a political solution to this conflict. They're not going to get their military reconquista.
Thank you for that, and I'm essentially out of time. Chairman, I yield back, and thank you, Mr. Rayburn, for your comment.
Thank you, Mr.
And beat Navy, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, beat him.
Mr. Espaillat.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I turn to Mr. Rayburn, I would like to acknowledge the chairman's final hearing and thank him for his tireless commitment to this committee. Chairman Engel and I share neighboring districts, and he has been a wonderful friend and mentor to me in my first 2 terms. And while in the state senate, I represented his home district as a state senator. So our friendship is deep, and I value it, and I wish him all the very best. My question is that despite the dire threats facing refugees to return to Syria, neighboring states like Lebanon and Turkey that have hosted thousands of Syrian refugees since the beginning of the civil war in 2011 are increasingly calling on those Syrians to return home. Reports have emerged, verifiable reports have emerged that Syrian refugees have been forced to return from both neighboring states, including hundreds in the late 2019 year, documented by both Amnesty International and various Lebanese press reports throughout 2020. These evictions and forced returns from Syria, of Syrians from Lebanon are very well documented. Could you provide an update on the latest in terms of these forced refugee returns, Mr. Rayburn?
Yes, Congressman, thank you for raising this. It's really important. I think less so Turkey, because I think Turkey shares with us the fundamental position that refugee returns have to be safe, voluntary, and dignified, and there has to be an independent assessment that conditions on the ground are safe enough for people to return. In Lebanon, we've had a challenge with that with our Lebanese counterparts, and we have seen them try to remove the voluntary out of that formula of safe, voluntary, and dignified. And there has been a great deal of pressure on Syrian refugees from time to time to try to coerce some of them to go home. We have tried to make it very clear in our engagements with Lebanese counterparts that it's unacceptable to see refugees of any kind suffer refoulement back to Syria when we know that the conditions. Sorry.
Are these refugees safe going back there? Or are their lives in danger? What is the status, for the most part, of these refugees?
I think you can say, Congressman, the situation in Syria is not safe for people who would like to return home. Because simply put, the Assad regime has not ended its war against the Syrian people. And that's the sine qua non. That's the starting point if there's going to be the creation of conditions on the ground in Syria where people will feel safe enough to voluntarily go back.
So what additional steps should the U.S. take to work with our other partners, as well as multilateral organizations like the UN, to prevent these forcible returns that could lead to the deaths of many of these refugees?
I think we have to look at if there's I mean, there are avenues open to us, even in terms of if it gets down to economic sanctions, certainly political pressure. But we will issue warnings to those if we see that kind of activity beginning. We will issue warnings to those countries. Now, at the same time, it's incumbent on us, I think, in the international community to continue supporting those countries who have very meager resources and who are bearing the burden and the pressure of having to host a large refugee population, to help them with resources to make it so that they can bear that burden better.
Let me turn real quickly to the Caesar sanctions. Now, I can think that we can all safely say that although throughout the decades, the United States has applied a range of sanctions to Syria and the Assad government, it really hasn't significantly changed the behavior of the government. What makes the Caesar sanctions different?
The Caesar sanctions, first of all, I love the Caesar sanctions as someone who is implementing them, because not only does it mean that we can use the prongs that are within the Caesar sanctions, it means that everyone we designate under any Syria authority, the Caesar Act attaches secondary sanctions to them. And that is what is really powerful, because it's not just the people or the businesses or the organizations that we sanction directly. It's anyone that does business with them or interacts with them is vulnerable to sanctions as well. And that is where we get the real power of the Caesar Act. I think you are seeing things change on the ground in Syria. The Syrian regime did not dream that it would be at the end of 2020 and would have its currency crashing, its regime economy failing, and its resources that it uses to fund its war against the Syrian people dwindling the way it has. And I think the Caesar Act has played the central role in helping to bring that situation about. So I think things are changing, and you'll see that more in the coming months.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Espaillat. Thank you. Ms. Wild. Ms. Wild? Okay, we'll move on. Mr. Levin?
All right, Mr. Chairman, here I am. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you, hear you fine. Excuse me, we can hear you fine.
Thank you so much. Well, I want to start by just expressing my immense gratitude to you for your service to this nation, to this House, to this committee, and your mentorship and friendship to me in particular. I will never forget coming to Congress and one courts the chairman of the committees one wants to serve on. And not only were you gracious and respectful of me as a freshman, but your enthusiasm for the work of this committee and the sort of intellectual depth you bring to it, it just has been a real inspiration to me. And so that's something that I will take forward with me. So I'm really grateful to you for all that. So let me
Thank you.
let me ask a question about chemical weapons. Earlier this year, the administration reported, and I'm quoting, "We believe the Assad regime is seeking to reestablish strategic weapons production capabilities it lost in the course of the conflict, and we continue to see Syrian procurement activity in support of its chemical weapons and missile programs." So aside from sanctioning Syrian individuals, what is the State Department doing to respond to a renewed Syrian chemical weapons program, and is there a diplomatic strategy?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, there is a diplomatic strategy, and it's it can be summarized in building an international consensus, building a coalition of like-minded countries to use all of their pressure, political, economic, whatever kind, some law enforcement, to hold the Syrian regime accountable, not just for the chemical weapons use that has been documented in the past, but this very real danger that the Syrian regime retains the ambition to reconstitute its chemical weapons arsenal. Right now, you're seeing on the diplomatic side, I think the most important forum that's underway right now is at the OPCW in The Hague, where we and many other like-minded countries are going through a process of following up on the OPCW's ultimatum to the Syrian regime to come clean and to about its chemical weapons use and its program. And if not, then to be under the danger of suspension from the OPCW.
Sir, so would you say that this is a good example of the importance of multilateral institutions and of the U.S. working collaboratively with many allies to achieve our foreign policy goals?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, well, that's good, and I hope on a going forward basis we'll really emphasize our work with other countries and not take a go-it-alone approach. Let me ask you about the humanitarian situation. As of this fall, roughly half of Syria's pre-war population remains internally displaced, 6.2 million people, or registered as refugees in neighboring states, 5.6 million people. And nearly 80% of the remaining population is living below the poverty line. The U.S. has directed more than $11.3 billion towards Syria-related humanitarian assistance since FY 2012, and Congress has appropriated billions more for security and stabilization initiatives in Syria and neighboring countries. What is the administration's humanitarian assistance strategy, given the dire circumstances in Syria right now?
Thank you, Congressman. Actually, after the last fiscal, when we bring it up to date, we're actually over $12.2 billion in humanitarian assistance that the United States has contributed for the Syrian people since the beginning of the conflict. Strategy right now is to try to continue to continue the humanitarian assistance flow, especially cross-border into northern Syria. Right now, we're in the middle of trying to work with the UN agencies and other humanitarian providers to do winterization because there's the onset of winter in Syria, which can be very harsh. The conditions are awful. We also, over the last several months, were able to put together assistance for Syrians inside and outside Syria of $141 million to address the particular emergent needs brought on by the COVID pandemic, which has hit Syria very, very hard. So I think in the coming months, what you'll see us do is try to, and we've had to respond to the Russian pressure to reduce the capacity to reduce the UN mandate to do cross-border assistance. So I think what you'll see us do in the coming months is continue to work with like-minded countries to lock in ways to have that humanitarian assistance be predictable and continue enduring into the liberated territories of northern Syria, at the same time that we watch for measures to try to contain the COVID pandemic in Syria. Those are, I would say, the two priority areas right now.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has
Mr. Chairman, I
retired.
see my time's expired, but it's difficult to say this for the last time, but with gratitude, I yield back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. I very much appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you so much. Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I join in the comments of my colleagues about your service. It's been my great honor to be on this committee with you as the chairman. I'm going to be moving as I ask this question because I'm about to run out of charge, and I apologize for that, but I will go ahead. And I wanted to start, Mr. Rayburn, sort of following up on what Mr. Levin just asked you about. And that is, and without restating the obvious that all of us are aware of in terms of the terrible suffering that is happening in Syria, I do want to know whether you believe that we should reevaluate our sanctions policies towards Syria. We'll just limit it to Syria right now. In light of the unintended effects that those sanctions appear to be having on everyday Syrians' food supply in areas controlled by the Assad regime. And I guess a follow-up to that is what specific steps is the administration taking to help alleviate the hunger crisis in Syria?
Thank you, Ms. Wild. So over the last, since the beginning of fiscal year 2020, the United States has actually spent $1.7 billion on humanitarian assistance to Syrian people. So we've stepped up our contribution. At the same time, we've made very clear through our diplomatic engagements, through our engagement with civil society and business communities, that there are specific carve-outs to our sanctions programs so that we do not constrain humanitarian assistance on the ground, nor things like food production. The Assad regime has undertaken, along with its allies, a propaganda campaign to claim that we do. But we've clarified at every opportunity that we don't sanction that kind of activity. The kind of people and businesses and organizations that we're sanctioning under our sanctions program right now are the worst of the entourage of Bashar al-Assad and his regime, and they're not doing anything to the kind of people we're sanctioning, kind of organizations we're sanctioning, are not doing anything to alleviate suffering of the Syrian people. They're the ones causing the suffering of the Syrian people. So in particular, under the Caesar Act, the point of the Caesar Act is to put pressure on the regime so that they will stop killing and stop inducing the suffering of Syrians. So I think the regime is propaganda, tries to put it absolutely upside down.
So let me ask you this: how much assurance do you personally feel that the humanitarian aid that the United States is providing is actually getting to the everyday Syrians?
I think we can be more confident of that in places where we have access, Northeast Syria, for example, and in places where we have NGO partners that can have less restricted access. That's northern Syria. We're less confident of that in places that the Assad regime controls. There's always the risk of diversion, but it's something that we stay in close touch with the UN agencies to try to guard against things like Assad regime cronies being able to get subcontracts by using front companies and things like that to implement assistance that they then will divert into, militia hands, Assad, Shabiha hands, or other Assad regime crony hands.
And I'm going to switch gears and try to be quick because I'm running out of time, but I want to return to the issue of Ambassador James Jeffrey and some statements that he made, specifically one in an interview last month in which he said, "We were always playing shell games to not make clear to our leadership how many troops we had there." My question to you is that statement accurate, number one? And number two, what is the actual number of troops we have in Syria today?
In terms of the actual troop numbers, I would defer to the Defense Department for comment on that. And I know, for example, simply put, troop numbers are beyond the purview of the State Department. I mean, that's for the Defense Department to set. And we all
okay. Can you comment on Ambassador Jeffrey's comment?
Sure. I mentioned this earlier in the hearing. The State Department team from Secretary Pompeo on down has been very diligent in executing the guidance of the president. And in my experience, at no time did the State Department mischaracterize the military posture in Syria. We had no reason to do that. We didn't have the responsibility to either set force levels or to report them to the White House. So as far as I know, that did not happen.
Thank you. The gentlewoman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Weil. Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And of course, I will very much miss you all, but I don't think that this is goodbye. I think that we will talk and see one another. But thank you for being such a good mentor to me and to so many others. My question has to do with a statement that was made by CENTCOM Commander General McKenzie about Syrian refugees. And the quote that I have is that he said, "Unless the international community finds a way to repatriate, reintegrate into home communities, and to support locally grown reconciliation programming for these people, we are buying ourselves a strategic problem 10 years down the road when these children will grow up radicalized. If we don't address this now, we're never really going to defeat ISIS." And that's what he said. So my question is, do you agree, sir, with General McKenzie's assessment? And what role has the State Department played in this effort? What role should the State Department play in this effort?
I do agree with General McKenzie's assessment. I do think the number of Syrian refugees and displaced people, outside Syria, inside Syria, is so immense. It's a population that is very vulnerable to radicalization in the future, and it's something that has to be addressed. The number one way to address that is to end the conflict through a political solution under UN Security Council Resolution 2254 so that the war ends, so that conditions inside Syria change, and so refugees and IDPs can go back home. That is the single greatest thing that we can do. That's what the State Department team works for 24/7. Now, in terms of the specific threat of refugee and IDP settlements, camps, especially inside Syria, we work very hard to try to encourage repatriation of non-Syrians back to their countries of origin. And that's really hard because a lot of the countries of origin don't want to take them back. They're not open to taking them back. So it's going to take a lot of diplomatic energy. We've got to redouble our efforts to try to press those countries to take their people back, and some of them are not good people. We know that. Some went off and joined ISIS, or went off and joined Al Qaeda, so they're a danger. But it's doing no good to anyone for them to remain in Syria.
So as we are talking about the progress in defeating ISIS and Al-Qaeda that we've made, how do you in the State Department kind of envision reconstruction in Syria, specifically the role that the U.S. plays in that effort, and also, frankly, kind of what lessons have we learned from Afghanistan, or bad lessons or good lessons that we've learned from Afghanistan, and how should those lessons be applied in the reconstruction of Syria?
Concerning reconstruction and concerning really, which is another way of saying, I think, normal economic relations between the international community and the Syrian government. We withhold that, and we press others to withhold that until the Syrian government has acceded to the implementation of the political solution under UN Security Council Resolution 2254. So until there's irreversible progress under 2254 in that political process, the United States should not contribute to reconstruction in Syria, and we shouldn't we should discourage others from doing so to keep the pressure on the Syrian government. As far as lessons from Afghanistan, I think you're probably meaning about the different studies that have been done about how reconstruction wound up fueling corruption and so on. And I think that's a problem that will have to be addressed when the time comes. It's one that we have to watch out for sure. I mean, I was involved in Iraq for many years, and we witnessed a similar problem in Iraq. So it is a problem. It's a problem I would like to have, though. That would be a better problem to have right now than having the war in Syria, raging fully. So if we get to a reconstruction phase, it should be once the political solution is irreversibly being implemented and the war is over.
So I only have a couple more seconds, but you spoke a little bit about the pressure that we had. Other than sanctions, what kind of other leverage could we use, to your point, to help the Syrian government find their way and to have other allies and non-allies help make progress a reality in this area? What other leverage points do we have? And I only have, I'm sorry, about a half a minute. 15 seconds.
Sure. The biggest way is political isolation. And accountability, including through law enforcement or international cooperation for law enforcement. Isolation has to remain. The Assad regime, Syrian government, has got to remain isolated from the international economy, from the international community, until it exceeds to 2254.
Okay. Thank you.
I've run out of time and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Houlihan. Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Malinowski here? Okay, we'll move on. Mr. Vargas.
I'm here.
Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, I was muted. First of all, just wanted to add my words to all the words of thanks and praise that you've received. It's been such a pleasure and honor for me to work with you on this committee for the last 2 years. Somebody mentioned that there will be a portrait of you hanging in the committee. There are many former chairmen with portraits. There are, I think, very few former chairmen who have had streets named after them in the capitals of countries that the United States has helped as you have been honored, which is a tribute to you and to the kind of American leadership that you have championed and will continue to champion through your career. Since it's the last hearing of the year, I also just want to say a word of thanks to everyone I've had a chance to work with, my subcommittee chairs, Mr. Castro, Mr. Deutsch, to the members on the Republican side with whom I've partnered, Mr. Kinzinger and Curtis, Ms. Wagner, our ranking member, of course. The bipartisanship on this committee is wonderful. And members of the committee staff who've been so helpful to me, Mira Resnick and Jen Hendrickson White, who helped so much with the Hong Kong bill that we passed this week, Ed Rice, Nora Carey, J.D. Baer, to Sanjit Gandhi, Janice Kaguyatan, and so many others for their hard work. I just have a couple of questions to Mr. Rayburn on the subject of today's hearing. I think a number of members have raised all of the problems that arose from the president's aborted decision to withdraw troops from Syria and to leave our allies in northeastern Syria in the lurch, so to speak. Fortunately, that was aborted, but I think there's been less attention paid to the decision the administration made to basically stop stabilization funding for the parts of Syria to which we do have access, including not spending appropriated funds or seeking additional funds from Congress. I think the argument was made, well, our allies are stepping up. Most of that money from our so-called allies was from Saudi Arabia, which has very different priorities and values from the United States. And so my first question to you, Mr. Rayburn, is really on where that stands in terms of American contributions to stabilization, USAID programming in those areas, and would you recommend to the next administration that the United States play a leading role on the civilian side, in addition to the military side, in the parts of Syria to which we have access?
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. We do agree. We're in a stabilization phase in the campaign against ISIS in eastern Syria and in Iraq as well, and so stabilization activities of all kinds have to continue. Stabilization, I mean, that includes military stabilization, but it's also reestablishment of essential services to try to get those communities up on their feet. Of course, we do contribute as well with humanitarian assistance, and the stabilization projects in Syria to date have totaled about $1.3 billion. That has included, as you mentioned, contributions from our Gulf partners. The Saudis contributed $100 million. The Emiratis contributed $50 million that were used across 2018 and 2019. Those went into U.S. programs, so they were not independently executed by the Saudi government or the Emirati government. So they went according to our priorities, and they funded our projects. And so, yeah, stabilization activities like that need to continue, and we'll continue both doing what we can from the U.S. side, but also trying to solicit partner contributions as well. And there have been a number of stabilization activities that continue under the auspices of our partners in the global coalition as well.
Thank you. I guess final question with the little time I have left. We're all concerned about the humanitarian situation for ordinary Syrians under Assad's control. You began to address this, but like to what extent? How would you weigh the balance in terms of responsibility for suffering of ordinary civilians in, say, Damascus, between sanctions and the Assad regime's own economic policies and corruption?
I think we have to, well, we have to continue the pressure that we're applying, and we have to try to target that precisely as possible so that we're sanctioning the parts of the regime that we need to sanction in such a way that it's not having a spillover effect to harming the Syrian people. But, I mean, in the end, as I mentioned earlier in the hearing, the single greatest thing we can do to try to end suffering of the Syrian people is to hold the Assad regime accountable so that it has to stop the war, and it has to accede to the political solution, come into the political process in a meaningful, irreversible way. You have to understand, the Assad regime is still bombing Syrian people. It's still shelling Syrian people. It's still disappearing the Syrian people into its prisons right now. And that is the single greatest cause of suffering of the Syrian people.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Rayburn, thank you for your testimony today. In August, the New Republic reported that an American shell company has gotten an unusual license to export Syrian oil. The report alleges that the company is closely connected to a prominent donor to certain U.S. politicians. The report also alleges that you and Ambassador Jeffrey met with Nechivaran Barzani to talk about this deal. Can you tell us why you met with Mr. Barzani to discuss this deal? And also, did you meet with Mr. Barzani to discuss oil deals with any other American companies, or only the one that was for this particular prominent donor?
So, Congressman, I mean, you're speaking about the license that was issued to Delta Crescent Energy to help the local authorities of Northeast Syria to try to raise the efficiency of those local oil installations that our local partners control. We supported that. We issued foreign policy guidance. The Treasury Department issued a license. We supported that because we support trying to get the economy of Northeast Syria up and running to the extent that it can under the present, conditions of war across Syria. So, I mean, we thought it was a good thing for not just U.S. companies but others to be able to come in to help the local communities stand back up on their feet. We're talking about the communities that were they were victimized by ISIS. They were in the heartland of the caliphate. So when you go through those communities, they're completely blasted from years and years of war. They need everything. So for them to be able to use their resources, oil resources.
But did you lobby for this deal for this particular company?
No, we didn't lobby. I would have to. We didn't lobby anyone for the deal. We issued.
You had a discussion about it, though. You had a meeting about it.
Oh yes, we've met with we've met with members of that company. We met with local authorities.
You met with Mr. Barzani also.
With Netravan Barzani, yes.
Yes. And did you discuss deals for any other American companies besides that one?
No.
So just that one deal?
That I was involved in, yes.
Yeah, the reason I asked the question, this is a huge donor to some important U.S. politicians. I'm going to editorialize a little bit, but I don't know that there would be too much dispute from many Americans that we're just leaving what has been a dark period of corruption and graft, some cases fraud, that has been looked the other way at, sometimes I would argue encouraged by the Trump administration. And so that's the genesis of my question.
I don't have any visibility on those aspects, Congressman. I mean, this was a straightforward issue of issuing foreign policy guidance for a license request, which is something that we do routinely.
All right, I'm going to ask you about some humanitarian issues real quick, and following up on Mr. Malinowski's question. Despite a large portion of Syrian territory no longer facing active fighting, the humanitarian situation has only worsened. More than half the Syrian population needs humanitarian assistance, as you know. The UN announced earlier this year that 9.3 million people are now food insecure, an all-time high. Many Syrians report waiting 6 hours to purchase bread if they can afford it at all. And you said in your written testimony that the administration has ensured that our sanctions against Syria are not impeding essential assistance to the Syrian people. This is commendable, and certainly Assad and his allies have actively subverted humanitarian aid. Still, most NGOs working on the ground say our sanctions are actively hindering their ability to deliver assistance to the Syrian people. And so my question is, what, if any, what steps, if any, will you take to reduce the humanitarian impact of our sanctions? For instance, are you willing to whitelist certain Syrian organizations and banks to allow NGOs to transfer money and purchase supplies from them?
Congressman, we already do that. Anytime, I mean, there is a problem in the humanitarian community of overcompliance, where banks or other institutions overcomply with our guidance. We tried to work with Treasury to clarify that. OFAC has issued guidance over time explaining exactly what's permissible and what's not under our Syria sanctions program. So I feel pretty confident that we're making headway there. In terms of, and when we get specific instances from a humanitarian NGO or something where they're denied the ability to open a bank account or something like that, we can engage with the business or the bank to clarify our policy to them. We're willing to do that all the time.
Are you back, Chairman? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Castro. Mr. Trone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to add to the remarks that have already been made and how much myself and so many members have really appreciated your leadership on this committee. It has just been spectacular for a long, long period of time. And the key that's made this committee so successful and so productive is your spirit of bipartisanship. And that's really, that type of leadership is what we need, throughout this Congress. I'd also like to call out the tremendous work that you've done in the Middle East area. And that's been so important to our most important ally over there, Israel. Your mentorship and friendship has also really meant a lot to me as a freshman member. It's just so wonderful to have someone that can help you learn the ropes and give someone like myself guidance. And so I really, really want to thank you and appreciate it for your service.
Thank you, Mr. Trone. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you. If the witness could talk about, and it's already been touched upon already, the dire threats facing the refugees returned from Syria, from neighboring states, Lebanon, Turkey, that have hosted thousands of Syrian refugees since beginning the civil war in 2011. And now they're increasingly calling for Syrians to return home. Reports have emerged that Syrian refugees being forced to return from both of the neighboring states, including hundreds at the end of late 19, documented by Amnesty International and by various Lebanese press reports of evictions and forced returns of Syrians from Lebanon. And I'd like to know kind of what extent, if at all, is the U.S. working to remind neighboring countries, such as Lebanon and Turkey, under their obligations under international law?
Thank you, Congressman. I think with respect to Turkey, we have a good understanding with the government of Turkey, and we both share the fundamental view that refugee returns have to be safe, voluntary, and dignified. And I think we have a good coordination with Turkish counterparts on that. With respect to Lebanon, it's been more challenging. And in my previous role as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Levant Affairs, I and my colleagues have had to interact with Lebanese counterparts from time to time to remind them that refugee returns have to be those three characteristics: safe, voluntary, and dignified. There are some Lebanese political figures who would like to line through the voluntary aspect, but we've reminded them that that's not acceptable. By the same token, we've tried to continue to do our part in marshaling international community support to help alleviate the burden that the refugee hosting countries bear, because some of them, are of very meager resources. Lebanon is one. Lebanon is going through a very, very difficult economic crisis. Jordan is another one. And so these are countries that I think, it's important for us to continue to have the international community provide assistance so that the refugee burden can be alleviated, but not at the expense of removing that voluntary aspect of refugee returns. And then again, in also trying to push for the single greatest thing that could make refugee returns to Syria possible, which is for Bashar al-Assad and his regime to end their war against the Syrian people and go into a political process to get to a political solution to the conflict.
Thank you. And quickly, what do the armed U.S. partner forces in Syria expect from the United States over the short term, the medium and long term? What are they looking for us to do?
I think so. The main one you're talking about is the Syrian Democratic Forces and other local partner forces in northeast Syria. And I think what they expect, and I think what they can count on, is that the global coalition to defeat ISIS is going to be maintained, and that the campaign to defeat ISIS by, with, and through local security partners will continue, not just in Syria but in Iraq, because it's a problem that spans both countries.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trone. Mr. Vargas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I also want to join my voice to all those other voices that have congratulated you, Mr. Chairman. I have to say that I learned of Elliot Engel when we adopted a Muslim family. My wife and I adopted a Kosovar family, the Shalabi, because of the ethnic cleansing that was going on there. And they asked if I knew President Clinton at the time, which I did, and Elliot Engel. I didn't know Elliot Engel, but I know Elliot Engel now, and I know why he has a street named after him and also stamps because of your great work there. And of course, they have incredible respect for you, as do I. And I will miss you very much, and especially the work you did in
Last hearing today.
the Middle East, and in particular, the work that you did around peace and Israel. I do want to ask Mr. Rayburn, thank you for being here. I do want to ask you a little bit more about the refugee issue. Now, I've been to the refugee camps in Lebanon, both in Beirut and the Bekaa Valley. I've also been to the refugee camps in Jordan, and I've been to the refugee camps in Egypt, where there's Syrians. I have to tell you, the conditions are not great. In some situations, better than others. But one of the things that I did see was that a lot of the countries in the Middle East really weren't stepping up and doing their fair share of putting money into these camps to help out. Now, has that changed?
The contributions from international community, like-minded countries to the refugee problem has remained pretty high. We have not seen it decrease. And this year, there was the main forum of the Brussels Donors Conference, which is co-hosted by the EU and the UN. We got another set of good pledges. So I think the international, so far, fingers crossed, the international community is continuing its level of support.
But what about the Gulf countries? I mean, that's the criticism that I heard there, that a lot of the wealthy countries in the Middle East had not put a lot of money themselves, that they had sort of walked away and instead allowed the rest of the world to shoulder most of the burden.
Congressman, I would have to get back to you on and check what the Gulf countries' contribution has been to assistance for the refugee communities outside of Syria. I don't have that in front of me right now.
Okay. And I would say also, I mean, it's been some time since the first time I went there. They've been in these refugee camps now for a long time, and things do happen. Children grow up there. They learn how to live like refugees, which is difficult. I know that they can't repatriate right now, and you said to repatriate that have to be safe and dignified, and I don't want to put words in your mouth. You said safe, voluntary, and dignified. And I know they can't do that at the moment. And since they can't, why don't we receive more of these refugees ourselves? I mean, I think it's a real scandal that we don't accept more of these Syrian refugees. Why don't we?
So, Congressman,
Mr. Rayburn, are you there?
I'm here, Congressman. Since the start of the conflict in 2011, the United States has resettled more than 22,000 Syrian refugees. In fiscal year 2020, that we resettled 481, and currently there are 29,000 Syrian nationals who are pending processing in our refugee admissions program. So I would say the refugee process continues for now.
Well, it certainly continues, but at a meager pace. I mean, there are so many refugees that you see went to Turkey. I mean, Turkey, in my understanding, has over 3.5 million refugees from Syria. And yet we're looking at 400 this year. I mean, that to me seems scandalous, that we're not doing our fair share to receive these people who are in dire need. But I guess I would just end, and I want to thank you. I know you've been working hard. This is not a criticism of you, but it is a criticism of this administration that hasn't been willing to welcome Muslim refugees into our country at the level that we should be, because they're in dire straits. And lastly, I would say, of course, we've been talking about the issue of Ambassador Jeffries. I would highlight that back in 2016, he was one of the 50 Republican security officials who signed that letter that Donald Trump was not qualified to be president, commander-in-chief, that's a quote, and that he would put our country's national security and well-being at risk. So of course, hiding things from the president because he was afraid the president didn't know what the hell he was doing. Thank you again, and I do thank you for your service. I know you're a very capable person. We have very many capable persons in the administration, and I appreciate it. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. Mr. Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to concur with my colleague, Congressman Vargas's comments, not only on the refugees, not only Turkey, but Jordan's done a great deal, but also his comments upon our Ambassador Jeffries as to the president's conduct on foreign policy, I would say overall. Special Envoy Rayburn, I want to redirect the questioning. A lot has been discussed this morning about Turkey's involvement in Syria and what their real intentions are and the different alliances that they've played on. And I would like, with your expertise, to have you make a comment with regards to Turkey's regional ambitions, not only as it relates to Syria, but I, along with many of my colleagues, have been very, very upset and concerned with their interaction with Azerbaijan acting as a proxy with Armenia, and where that has put Armenia in a very precarious position at this point in time, given the resolution that I think was forced on Armenia by Russia and Turkey as it relates to Azerbaijan and the territory in dispute with Artsakh. What is Turkey's, they've got tremendous problems right now with not only the pandemic, but with their economy. And Erdogan has taken this country in such a bad direction, in my view, the jailing of journalists and such. It's not the Turkey that we knew 2 decades ago, and frankly, I'm not sure that they're worthy of continuing to be a partner in NATO, given their actions in recent years. Could you care to comment, please?
Thank you, Congressman. Turkey's involvement beyond Syria in places like Azerbaijan and others is beyond my lane, and I can't answer for what Turkey thinks its interests are in those other crises or those other places. In Syria, with Turkey, we try to maintain as constructive a dialogue as possible. What Turkey does to protect the civilians of northwest Syria who have been under incredible assault from the Assad regime and the Russians for several years. This is something that we support, as do other like-minded countries, including many European countries, and where there are tensions in places like the border zone of northeast Syria, we work very hard to try to diffuse those tensions and to make the atmosphere as constructive as possible. We don't succeed in that all the time, and there have been some real ups and downs, some real challenges. But I would say right now there's a tense calm in northeast Syria and in northwest Syria. I would say we need the Turks to continue doing what they've been doing.
Well, what do you think their real goals are toward the Kurds when you talk about northeast Syria?
That's difficult to say. I think we can say what we believe is in the best interest of both, which is for there to be a secure and peaceful border between northeast Syria and Turkey, so that the communities on both sides of the border can live in peace. And we try to apply our diplomatic energy to diffusing tensions and trying to help both sides point toward that kind of future.
But when you look at all the players in Syria, you could make a case that there's 4 different conflicts that are going on, and it just doesn't seem to me that, notwithstanding all of your efforts, Mr. Rayburn, that it's not clear. You opened your statement by indicating that you thought that things were turning out in a way that might provide positive outcomes for our intentions and our allies, but that doesn't seem to be clear to me.
Well, I strongly believe that, and I'm not just, you know, in my background, I don't think I'm an irrational optimist. I lived through the whole Iraq conflict, and that was a pretty depressing one. The Syria situation is pretty depressing too, in conditions on the
Very
ground.
depressing.
But I think we're on a different trajectory now, and I think you'll see that in months to come. Our leverage is going to grow month by month, and I think that our adversaries have hit their peak and they're waning now. That's my personal judgment.
Well, my time has expired, but I hope that your note of optimism is warranted because it still doesn't seem to be clear to me that that is evident. But we'll continue to work on all of the above and hope for the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. Mr. Al Green of Texas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Castro, Mr. Chairman, for your friendship and the many things you've done. I also am an interloper today, so I have to thank the chairperson, Mr. Engel, for allowing me to have this opportunity. I thank Mr. McCall for his friendship, not only here, but also on Homeland Security. Mrs. Pelosi, Speaker, helped us with this issue related to Austin Tice, as did Mr. Hoyer, so I thank them as well. I've been on this 8-year mission, a mission of mercy, along with the Tice family, to secure the return of Austin. And as is known by the people who are here, HRES 17 passed the House recently, bipartisan, bicameral support. It received little attention in the press, which is the predicate for my question. Has this been called to the attention of the President, HRES 17, which would have Mr. Tice and Mr. Kamal Moss returned home? Do you know whether it's been called to the attention, Mr. Rayburn, of the President?
I don't personally know that, Congressman, but knowing the attention that the President has given to the Austin Tice issue, as well as other, unjustly detained or missing Americans, I cannot imagine that it wasn't brought to the White House's attention. And I know my counterpart, Ambassador Roger Carstens, who works on hostage affairs, I know he was very well informed about that House resolution, and so I'm pretty confident this has been it's been reported, made available up the chain.
Thank you. Moving to another question, UNSCR 2254, does it preclude a negotiated return of Mr. Tice and Mr. Kamal Moss?
No, not at all.
And given that this resolution has passed and the President's aware of it, and we can have a negotiated return of these two persons, and by the way, I would want all persons returned as well. I just happen to be familiar with these two, and I would hope that the family members who heard me make my earlier comments would understand that I want their relatives returned home too. It's important. They've missed them. But given that we've done this, is there anything that you can share with reference to a negotiated return of our friends, of these Americans?
For a fuller accounting of that engagement, I would defer to Ambassador Carstens. What I can say is that we strongly believe that the Syrian government has information about the status, whereabouts of these missing Americans, including Austin Tice, that they have not shared. And we believe that they have it within their means to effect a return of Austin Tice, and certainly a disclosure of his and other missing Americans' status. And they so far have been unwilling to share that information, and they have been pressed by our side to do so.
My final question is something that I didn't really come to ask, but I rarely get this opportunity, so I will. Tartus and Sevastopol are pretty important to the U.S., up to Russia. Russia is a cold water country. Tartus gives Russia a place for its Black Sea fleet to be dispersed. And of course, Sevastopol does. Tartus gives it access to the Mediterranean. How likely is it that Russia will leave Syria, given that Tartus is fairly important to its global designs?
That's a good question, Mr. Green. We have not held out as a condition for the political solution to the conflict that the longstanding Russian military relationship with the government of Syria has to end. We haven't held that out. In fact, the language that we've used is that military forces, foreign military forces that are present in Syria that were not there before 2011 should leave as part of the political resolution to the conflict. So the Russians had a naval presence there for many decades before 2011, and we have not tried to press for their pre-existing relationship to end. Also, the relationship that the Syrian government would have within its international relations and its military relations, that's for the future Syrian government that will result from the political solution and the political transition process that's envisioned under 2254. That's for the Syrian people to decide in the future. So we rely on them to do that.
Mr. Chairman, you were more than generous. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Thank you, Mr. Rayburn, for your testimony. To the members, thank you for your comments and your questions. And as a reminder, any extraneous material can be submitted for the record. With that, we're adjourned. Thank you.